Good morning, everybody. So I don't know how to describe this group other than to say you are the spark plugs. We started this symposium in 1994, and then because of COVID, it disappeared, and we have been so eager to reignite it. So you're the sparks that got it reignited. Our goal is to grow it bigger and better, and make the Newport Symposium, we consider it now to be one of the centerpieces of our academic offerings here at the Preservation Society, and we want to continue that. For those of you who are not members or knowledgeable about the Preservation Society, our mission is very simple. It is to preserve, present, and protect. Preserve, present, and protect Newport's historic houses, its collections, and its landscapes. And we've been around for 80 years, and the belief in the fact that these places are not just beautiful houses, they are essential to the understanding of our shared history and cultural identity is the basis of what we do. So over the next 2 days, we are going to delve into France's influence on Newport, and we hope that by the end of the 2 days, you will walk away with a deeper understanding of the overwhelming presence in food, fashion, architecture, design, and culture that has been played here in Newport, and highlighting this city despite its size, 25,000 people, as a major player in international conservation and how we eat, how we live, how we are as a nation. The symposium isn't just about history, it's about connection between continents, between disciplines, between past and present, and amongst all of you. So whether you are a scholar, a student, a preservationist, or simply a person who just loves history and beauty, we hope that you will leave inspired and deeply connected to the legacy of Newport and its French roots. If you have ever dreamed of stepping into a French palace without crossing the Atlantic, you are in the right place, because this house, Rosecliff, was modeled after the Grand Trianon at Versailles, and after a $7.3 million restoration, which took place several years ago, I think it looks more magnificent than ever. We like to think of Rosecliff as a love letter to French elegance, which features a heart-shaped staircase, the largest ballroom in Newport, a glorious view of the Atlantic, and for those of you who I know, and everybody in this room does, watches HBO's The Gilded Age, that ceiling is one of the opening scenes. So we always cheer in my household when that show starts. So Newport and France have been connected since the 1780s, when the French and Navy and Army descended upon this city to provide aid in our fight for independence. And in fact, the French Navy was temporarily housed at our own Hunter House during that period. So since then, this broader culture has been looked to for inspiration. Before I go into introducing our keynote speaker, I do want to take a moment to express the thanks and gratitude of the Preservation Society to many people who made the symposium possible today. And they include the people who are sponsoring our sessions: Russell Moore and Catering, Best Food in Town, Kirby Perkins Construction, Newport Design Week, and the Newport Symposium Committee itself. There are members of our board and members of our committees, primarily the Symposium Committee here, or they are on Zoom, and I want to thank them, board members Sue Petrovas, Kate Enroth, and Kim Darden. Hello. And members of the Symposium Committee, Pauline Metcalf, Lydia Kimball, thank you, Lydia, Ulysses Dietz, and several who have joined us by Zoom, Lynn Roberts, Dave Dangermond, and George McNeely. And then finally, I think a real great They deserve an applause, in fact, is the Museum Affairs staff, led by Leslie Jones, who you just met and you will hear later in her panel, Kate Pedersen, Mackenzie Marin, and the whole crowd. So give them, please, a round of applause. And then finally, one of the features of the symposium is to provide scholarships to people who are worthy. And I know that we were very lucky to be able to support 9 scholars this year. And if they're in the room, I'd love to have them stand. Barbara Ramsey, Maddie Graham. Barbara, are you here? Maddie Graham, Maria Reynolds. I know Maria's here. I saw her a minute ago. Mary Grime Gallo, Megan Capix, Sakura Nakamura. Are you here? Seth Frost and Susan Courtney Weissman. So tonight we have thank you. Tonight we have a reception to grow our scholarship fund, and I hope there are a few tickets left. If you have never, I hope you can join us. If you have not seen Rosecliff at night, it's even more dazzling and glimmering and glittering than it is during the day. So now, it is my great honor to introduce a man who embodies the very spirit of this transatlantic dialogue, and that is Mathieu Deldicque. Dr. Deldicque is the director of the Musée Condé at the Château de Chantilly. It is one of France's most treasured cultural landmarks. I wonder how many of you have been there, because it is spectacular. It has to be on your bucket list. Chantilly is a place where history, art, and architecture converge. It is really a jewel of French heritage, shaped over centuries by princely dynasties and brought to its current glory by Henri d'Orléans, who I know you will hear more about when Mathieu speaks. 19th century look, which is a really interesting challenge, which I hope you will share with the audience today. It houses one of the finest collections of paintings in France, second only to the Louvre, and it preserves a legacy of French elegance and intellectual pursuit that really resonates deeply with the mission of the Preservation Society. Mathieu is a graduate of the Ecole Nationale des Chartes and the Institut National du Patrimoine. He holds a Ph.D. in art history. His career has spanned the French Ministry of Culture, where he, think about this job, oversaw national chateaus. I mean, can you imagine anything greater than that? And he has been with Chantilly for about a decade, where he has led major restoration projects and cultural exhibitions on Renaissance art, the decorative arts, and the story of the Duke of Aumale himself. He is also a member of the International Council of the Preservation Society, along with Anne Poulet, who is with us today. And we were so really honored to have a tour of Chantilly. The council was about a month ago, and it was the most inspiring and illuminating tour I think I've ever been on, so I thank you for that. Today, we're lucky to have Mathieu here from France to kick the conference off, and I really am indebted to you so much for being with us. Thank you. Let's give him applause.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be the keynote speaker of this great symposium, and I would thank all the team, Trudy, Leslie, Kate, and all the friends of Newport here. On June 1885, Richard Maurice Hunt and his family sailed for Europe to sharpen his aesthetic perception during a full year of visits. They went to Britain, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. But Paris remained their European home, and they returned to settle there for the winter. Hunt participated in the reception of the Institut de France, of which he was elected a corresponding member of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, Fine Arts Academy of the Institut de France. Here is the Institut de France, and the Institut de France is the owner of the Château de Chantilly. Actually, one of the members of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, Fine Arts Academy of the Institut de France, was Henri d'Orléans, Duc d'Aumale, here on the right, fifth son of the last king of France. The Duc d'Aumale was a long-time acquaintance of Richard Maurice Hunt since their student years. They share friends like the painters Adolphe Bougreau or Paul Baudry, and here are some Baudry paintings in the Château de Chantilly, ordered by the Duc d'Aumale. Baudry was Hunt's traveling companion in Venice in 1852. And as you know, he had painting also the salon sailing of William K. Vanderbilt House. So, back to 1885, Richard Maurice Hunt was invited to visit the Duc d'Aumale at Chantilly and to have lunch with him. 4 years later, in 1889, Hunt made another short trip to Europe, and it was this time a more professional one. George Vanderbilt, on the left, for whom Hunt had already made preliminary sketches for the great mansions he planned to build in Biltmore, near Asheville, North Carolina. So George Vanderbilt invited Richard and his wife to accompany him on a trip to Paris. This trip had a double purpose of visiting historic houses and chateaux, to get ideas for the projected dwelling at Biltmore, but also to collect furnishings and art objects for that huge residence. So that trip began in Britain. Richard Maurice and wife Catherine remained in London, but with George Vanderbilt, and Richard went on to Paris to meet there William K. Vanderbilt and Alva Vanderbilt about the work he planned for them for Marble House in Newport. And scarcely arrived in Paris when William K. and Alva Vanderbilt insisted that he join them for the Sunday horse races at Chantilly. And here is the horse ground of Chantilly. It's a 19th century photograph. At the race course, the Duc d'Aumale recognized Richard Maurice Hunt. Richard Maurice Hunt was with William K. and Alva Vanderbilt, as I mentioned. Hunt said in his memoirs that the Duc d'Aumale, his portrait of him, was a true général français, so French in manner and in appearance, and so military in his bearing. And so the Duc d'Aumale invited the Vanderbilts and Hunts to have another lunch to Chantilly at this great chateau. So who was the Duc d'Aumale? Here is a painting of the last king of France, Louis Philippe, in front of Versailles with his 5 sons. And the Duc d'Aumale is on the right. He's the 5th son of the last king. He was a very promising teenager, very intellectual, and actually at the age of 8 years old, he became the richest heir in France. He inherited the domain de Chantilly from the Prince de Condé family, who were the cousin of the kings, and he inherited the fortune, the richness of the Prince de Condé, and became the richest man in France. His grandeur was to rebuild the great Château de Chantilly, who was partly and mostly destroyed during the French Revolution, and here it is. So it's 40 kilometers north of Paris. It was a hunting place for the Condé family during the 17th and 18th century. Obviously, it's an estate with extensive gardens organized and created by André Le Nôtre, the gardener of Versailles. And it was a hunting place, so the stables are bigger than the chateau. There are 18th century stables still existing. When the Duc d'Aumale inherited Chantilly, it was like that, so partly destroyed, just a wing remained from the Renaissance. And so the Duc d'Aumale rebuilt at the end of his life, after 2 exiles, Chantilly, not for his family actually, because he lost all his 8 children, he lost his wife quite early, but to host his collection and to build a public museum. So nowadays Chantilly is a bit of Versailles. You have great 18th century apartments, apartments of the Prince de Condé. Here are some examples. So on the left, you have the bedroom of the 18th century bedroom of the Prince de Condé. On the right, the Singerie, the monkey room, one of the most favorite rooms for visitors. And the Duc d'Aumale created new apartments in that château, especially downstairs, the private apartments made for him and the Duchess during the 1840s, between 1845 and 1848. Here is the antechamber and the bedroom of the Duchess in neo-18th century style, or Rococo style of the 19th century. Here is a 16th century dining room. Here is the office of the Duc d'Aumale. So this was the first project of the Duc d'Aumale for his chateau, and Richard Morrisand, I will speak about that later, most likely saw those apartments. But the main part of that project was to build a museum. And as Trudy mentioned just before me, Chantilly is lucky to conserve nowadays the second most largest collection of old masters in France after the Louvre, thanks to the Duc d'Aumale, who was this greedy collector who, like actually some Gilded Age collectors, purchase en bloc collections in Britain, Italy, Germany, France, and so on. Here is the main painting galleries with a hanging, which is a kind of work of art, will remain the same as the Duc d'Aumale's time. When he bequeathed Chantilly to the Institut de France, in his testament, it's mentioned that it's forbidden to change the hanging and to lend the collection. So you have to come to me to visit me to see them. A few other rooms, some great paintings of Raphael, of Titian, Botticelli, and so on. Back to 1889. So the Duc d'Aumale project was built between 1875 and 1885. So 4 years later, the Vanderbilts and Richard Morrisand came to Chantilly. And here are 2 proofs of that. On the left, you have an archive from Biltmore, actually. It's an invitation of the Duc d'Aumale addressed to George Vanderbilt to come to visit him. And on the left, on the right, you have the agenda of the Duc d'Aumale, the diary. So 21st of June, 1889. So it's nowadays in the archives of the Musée Condé in Chantilly. And so it's written, the Vanderbilts and Les Hunt. So it's 2 proof of that visit, 2 documents. So we know that carriages were awaiting the Hunts and Vanderbilts at the railway station of Chantilly. Then they came, and the Duke was in his library here at the Château. With one of his brothers, the Duc de Montpensier and the Duchesse de Montpensier. And so the Duke greets the new arrivals and ushers them to the lavish lunch awaiting them in that banqueting hall. There were some dozens person at the table. So for Richard Morrisand, it was the second visit, but for the other guests, it was the first one. And we know also that the Duke gave them the use of his box at the Opera in Paris during their stay. When they came back to America, Hunt was inspired by his 2 visits of Chantilly for the 2 contemporary projects he built for the Vanderbilt. So the first one in Biltmore, the second one in Marble House, Newport. So you may know Biltmore, and I will be very short about that. So with this very French 15th century architecture linked with the Château de Blois, the Château de Chenonceau, the Château de Azay-le-Rideau, some Loire Valley architecture, so nothing to do with Chantilly. But inside, you have some connection with Chantilly, especially the library. We have same comfortable feeling inside, as you can see, and also the use of metalwork, which was quite new in France, actually, in that time. Actually, you even have an engraving of Chantilly Castle inside Biltmore, so it may be a memory, a souvenir of that visit. Back to Marble House. You all know better than me the history of that house, built by Richard Morris and for William Kay and Alva Vanderbilt between 1888 and 1892. As you know, Mrs. Vanderbilt was a true French lover. She was educating in France, where her family settled after the Civil War. She returned to France for long periods throughout her life, and she was inspired by France in her houses. As you know, and some colleagues will speak about that later, Jules Allard, the fashionable Paris decorator, worked for her and for many Newport mansions. So all the decoration, furniture, and so on were made or inspired by Paris. And the decor is predominantly Louis XIV and Louis XV inside the castle, but outside it's between Louis XIV and Louis XVI, so mostly 18th century French style. As lots of scholars mentioned before me, Hunt's creation was inspired by the Petit Trianon of Versailles, but the Grand Trianon also. So, as you know, the dining room is very linked with the Salon d'Hercule in the Château de Versailles, with this use of marbles, with obviously the paintings, the chimney-piece, the bronzes, and so on. You know also that above the stairs you have two medallions, the portrait of Richard Morris Hunt and the portrait of Jules Allard, the architect of Versailles. So nothing new about that. Another French connection that you know in Marble House is a Gothic room, which is something, we will speak later about that because there are some connection with Chantilly again, not in that, in the current one, but in the previous one with the collection. Obviously, it's linked with 15th century France, with Bourges, with Jacques, the banker of the King Louis Charles VII in the middle of the 15th century, who was a banker. So it's interesting to see some connection with the Vanderbilt as merchant, and Jacques was merchant and banker of Middle Ages in France. And the gold room also is linked with France, as you know, with the Galerie d'Apollon in the Louvre, with some Versailles also features. But what I wanted to point out today is the less known and maybe never noticed inspiration of Chantilly at Marble House. In both mansions, we notice the same taste of precious material. The floor and the walls of the entrance hall of Marble House are made of yellow Messina marble. And you can see here in the entrance hall of Chantilly the same taste of marbles. It's not a Sienna marble, it's more Belgian marbles, but the same, yes, preciousness of material for the entrance hall. In both entrance hall, we can admire wrought iron gilt bronze stair rails, very modern one. So the one of Chantilly here was made by the Moreau brothers in 1884, so it was a very recent project for Chantilly, and the Hunts actually and Vanderbilt met the Duc de Mal in that place, just outside the library that I showed to you. And in both entrance hall, you have 18th century Gobelin tapestries. So here is the one of Chantilly, and here is the one of Marble House. So actually, this is the same project with different inspiration, different architecture, but you have the same elements in both entrance hall. If we continue the visits, we can speak about the dining rooms. So here is the dining rooms banqueting hall of Chantilly, more 16th century style with this ceiling, with the architecture, some 17th century tapestries after 16th century drawings, but this room is called the stag rooms, la galerie, stag's gallery, the Galerie des Cerfs, and you can observe some stags everywhere. And as you know, in the dining room of Marble House, you have also stags, and there are no meanings in Marble House. In Chantilly, it was a hunting lodge, a hunting mansions. Why are there some stags in Marble House? Is there some souvenir of the stags of Chantilly? It's just an observation. In that dining room, as you know, you have some portraits, royal portraits of Louis XIV, but also Louis XV. And Louis XV was very important for Chantilly too. And in the biggest room of Chantilly, the painting gallery, you have a Louis XV portrait also, who oversees the visitors. Finally, the private apartments. When Richard Morris Hunt and the Vanderbilts came to Chantilly, the Duchess was already dead, unfortunately. She died in Britain, in exile, in 1869, so some 15 years earlier. But apartments remain the same, private apartments. It's a Rococo style of the 19th century bedroom, who was considered as very feminine during the 19th century in France for decorators, and very royal. The Duchesse d'Aumale was a Napolitan princess. She was a princess of Bourbon-Sicile, and she was a great niece of Marie Antoinette. So this style was very accurate for her personality. And I like to think about that connection with Alva Vanderbilt. She maybe saw the Duchesse d'Aumale bedroom during her visits, and maybe she wanted to live like the Duchesse d'Aumale in this great love of fabric, like this great Rococo style curve and shelves, and it's very feminine actually. Way of decoration, and also the use of pastels in the Duchesse d'Aumale apartments. In the several rooms, you have lots of 18th century pastels. So it's also linked between the two princes. What about the collections? Duc d'Aumale was a brilliant collector, as you know, and during the same trip in summer 1889, when Alva and William K. Vanderbilt came to Chantilly, they were above all in Paris for a shopping excursion. And this shopping excursion led Alva Vanderbilt to another stylistic conversion, a conversion for Gothic and Renaissance. She discovered the Parisian Émile Gavet collection. Here are some photographs of that collection in Paris, and she purchased 340 objects from him en bloc. The design of the Gothic room created after by Hunt or Allard, or both of them, was based on, as I mentioned, the 15th century Hôtel Jacquer in Bourges, and it was made to house the objects. And among the objects, as you know, and it was studied within an interesting catalog some years earlier, the collection is now in Sarasota, in the Ringling collection, and among the collection was a painting by Piero di Cosimo on the left, the building of a palace, And actually, one of the most famous paintings of Duc de Mal is a painting of Piero di Cosimo, same painter, Florentine painter of the late 15th century. This is a portrait of Simonetta Vespucci, the lover of Cosimo de' Medici, painted in the 40s, 80s. Another piece of that Gothic room is on the right. This is a portrait who was considered as a François Clouet portrait. So this is François Clouet is a famous portraitist of the French court during the 16th century, of Queen Catherine de' Medici and King Henry II. Actually, this portrait is not a good one. It's a forgery, 19th century forgery. So unfortunately, Alva's had not the same eye as the Duc de Mal, but what is interesting is the Duc de Mal was the most important collector of 16th century French portraits. And actually, nowadays, we have 100 portraits of the Clouet, Jean and François, the two portraitists of the 16th century, and 366 drawings by the same artist. So she surely have seen this collection, and maybe it was an inspiration for her. These collectors, the Duc de Mal and the Vanderbilts, attended sometimes the same sales to complete their collection. For instance, in 1882, the Vanderbilts were informed of the sale at Christie's in London in July the 10th of 1882. So the sale of the extraordinary collection of some 18th century French furnishing from Hamilton Palace, the seat of the 12th Duke of Hamilton. So the Vanderbilts sent some instruction to London dealers, Frederick Davis and Samson Wertheimer, to secure 2 lots for Mrs. Vanderbilt's. The 2 lots are now at the Met. It's Marie Antoinette's lacquered secretary and its matching commode by Jean-Henri Risner. And actually, the Duc de Mal was in the same sale, and he acquired, I don't know if he bid for the 2 secretary and commodes, but he bid and purchased those 2 desks, one by Leleu and for the minister Choiseul during the 18th century, and the other one by for the ambassador of for the introductor of the ambassador of Versailles, La Livre de Julie. So 2 neoclassical desks for his Château. And actually, the Duc de Mal loved Risner also, and he had in his collection 2 commodes. And maybe Alva saw the Risner commodes of Chantilly before purchasing her commode of Risner. Another linked for collection is that very interesting bull desk, or bureau plat, or flat desk, in the gold room of Marble House. So it's a 19th century copy of one ordered for Chantilly, and we have the original one. It was ordered by the Prince de Condé, so the Prime Minister of Louis XV, around 1720. And even though there are some difference in the bronzes and in the designs of the marquetry, it's a true link between the 2 collections. What about suppliers? So before coming here, I spent hours and hours in Tassinary and Château archives. This is a silk merchant in Paris, and actually this maison, this firm, worked a lot for the Duc de Mal. This is 1989, same year, commissioned by the Duc de Mal of a silk damask, red damask, for his gallery. And here, the gallery we just restored with thanks to the original sample we discovered. And actually, in the Tassinary and Château archives, you have many commissions of Allard, some of them for Marble House, some of them for all the mansions of Newport. So here are some examples. So obviously, as I thought, we usually speak about another supplier, which is Prel, another silk merchant based in Paris, but who worked in Lyon. And this is a sample of Prel, who was on sale a few years ago for Marble House and Alva Vanderbilt's commission. But actually, the Duc de Mal and the Vanderbilts share the same another supplier, which is Tassinari and Château, and there are many, many discoveries to make in the archives of Tassinari and Château for Newport Mansion, for Richard Morrison, for Allard, and the Vanderbilts. So same supplier, same taste, same taste of collection. Finally, what about exterior architecture? Actually, Richard Morrison knew very well the architect of Chantilly, Honoré Daumet. As you know, Hunt was the first American to study architecture in Paris at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, and in 1846 he was admitted to the school after an initial failure, and his classmate was Honoré Daumet, the architect of Chantilly. Daumet won the Prix de Rome in 1855, and Daumet founded his studio after his trip to Rome, and his studio was attended by Hunt's son, Richard Holland Hunt and Joseph Holland Hunt. So it's very, very strong connection between the two architects also. Hunt admired Daumet's great project at Chantilly, but if the interior of Chantilly inspired a bit Marble House, the exteriors has a very modest influence in Newport. The influence is more about Loire Valley Château, more about Versailles, Trianon, the Louvre sometimes, but what about Chantilly? Actually, we have to finish with another great mansion, the Brickers. It's more Italian than French, but when I found in the literature the first project for the Brickers, which is more French, I was very amazed by the wing on the left. This tower with this dome and the wing just after the tower on the left. And here is the link. Actually, this is my bureau, my office. But it's not the link. The link is the architecture. It's a kind of copy of a tower of Chantilly built by Honoré Daumet and admired by Hunt during his 2 trips in Chantilly. Here is another view of Chantilly with these very original towers that you don't find anywhere else in France, actually, so it's true link. And for the wing, just after the tower, actually, it comes from a 16th century ring of the oldest part of the chateau, the Renaissance parts, built by the architect Jean Bulan in the mid-16th century for the Constable Anne de Montmorency. And you can recognize the arch and the windows of the 2 levels in that wing in the first project for the Brickers. Unfortunately, they changed their minds, and Chantilly has no exterior influence in Newport. To conclude, obviously the influence of all French chateaux on Newport mansions has long been discussed. But architects and patrons were also interested in contemporary projects in France, and Chantilly was a contemporary project of Newport mansions at that time. The Duc de Mal was a source of inspiration for several Americans of the Gilded Age. He has connection with patrons like the Vanderbilts, with architects like Richard Morris Hunt. But his influence was not only in New York or Newport, but even Chicago. And here is one of the latest portrait of the Duc de Mal in his library in Chantilly. It was painted by an American portraitist, George Peter Alexander Healy, to adorn the new library of Chicago. So the last great French prince served, as you can notice, as a model for new American builders and collectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Was the Duc d'Allard similar to other French aristocracy in his welcoming of Americans, both like George Vanderbilt, but also Richard Morris Hunt? Or was he more exceptional in that he was a great art lover and therefore more open to sharing his table and his house with people of similar interest?
Yeah, the Duc d'Allard was very open to foreign visitors, actually, and art lovers. He spent more than 20 years in Britain, so he was very connected with the Anglo-Saxon world, I can say. And actually, he was a bit interested by America. His father, Louis Philippe, King Louis Philippe, came in America during his young time. And during his first exile, he was thinking at some point to come to America, to have an exile in America. So there was an interest, and obviously he was very proud of his project of Chantilly. He knew that it was to create a new public museum after his death, so he was very willing to share his collection and his project with art lovers, architects, and as Richard Morrison was involved with the Institute de France, the Fine Arts Academy, and the Duc d'Allard was also a member of the Fine Arts Academy, it was quite natural to welcome Richard Morrison and the Vanderbilts, but the true link is Richard Morrison.
Good morning. Thank you for a little talk. My name is Walter Ayers, and I have a lot of interest in the sporting traditions of the Gilded Age, and I think the Vanderbilts epitomized their interest in all things sporting. And I'm wondering, you mentioned the stag and the Marble House, and obviously this is a hunting lodge that they're looking at. Do you know if they took part in any of the, except for racing, the equestrian pursuits of the area? I mean, not maybe at the Duke, but other things that might have gone on, a period that kind of inspired them to bring this imagery to Newport.
Yes, the only visit of William K. and Alva Vanderbilt to Chantilly was for the race or the race horses, and that's when they met the Duc d'Allard in the tribune of the horse race ground, which is next to the Château, next to the stables. So obviously it was a strong connection, and as you can see in the study in Marble House of William K., you have lots of portraits of horses raised in Normandy, in Deauville, and so on. And Duc d'Allard was also a horse lover. So it's also one of the connections, first connection between the two men, yeah.
Any more questions? Yes.
Did the stable inspire anyone in America? The wonderful stable at Chantilly, the most beautiful stable in France.
In the world. Actually, I don't know. I'm not sure. Actually, maybe there's few explanations. When all these mansions of Gilded Age were created, horses were less important than during the 18th century, so they deserve smaller buildings. For Chantilly, it was for huntings, and it's not one of, as I know, one of the hobbies of the Gilded Age people here. Some huntings, like the chasse à courre, in France. So no, actually, the influence of the Chantilly stables were in Russia, 18th century and early 19th century stables in Russia.
Any more questions? Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And if you have more questions, I'm sure you're
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mathieu, for creating a perfect introduction to this year's symposium theme, The French Influence in Newport. I am very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Margot Bernstein, as she draws connections between elements of French history, art, and culture to Newport's own Miramar. As a 20th century interpretation of 18th century French architectural style, Miramar has long stood as one of Newport's great estates. As a member of the Kirby Perkins team, I am honored to represent our firm and the work we do to preserve Newport. From projects with the Preservation Society to our own work at Miramar leading its recent restoration, Kirby Perkins brings together a strong knowledge base, appreciation, and skill set that has contributed to Newport's continued excellence in architectural heritage. Now, to share a bit about our speaker, Dr. Bernstein specializes in 18th century French art and material culture. She holds a BA from Williams College, an MA from the Courtauld Institute of Art, and an MA, MPhil, and Ph.D. from Columbia University. Articles drawn from Dr. Bernstein's doctoral dissertation on the 18th century French draftsman Louis Carogy, called Carmontel, have been published in the Metropolitan Museum Journal and 19th Century Studies. Prior to taking up her current role as a curator of a private collection, Dr. Bernstein served as a Chester Dale Fellow in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and held curatorial internships at numerous New York museums, including the Frick Collection, New York Historical Society, Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Morgan Library and Museum. Welcome, Dr. Bernstein.
Helen and I are on different planes, literally. It's a pleasure to be here. All right. Miramar, loosely meaning a view of the sea, was commissioned by two members of the prominent Philadelphia-based Widener family, George Dunton Widener and Eleanor Elkins Widener. George's father, Peter Errol Brown Widener, was a self-made man who got his start as a butcher in Philadelphia, subsequently landing a contract to supply mutton to the Union Army during the American Civil War. P.A.B. Widener's ventures soon expanded into the world of transportation. He invested in streetcar lines with his business partner, William Luckins Elkins, Eleanor Elkins Widener's father, subsequently becoming one of the most successful transportation magnates around the turn of the 20th century. Oop, there's William. George Widener and Eleanor Elkins Widener married in 1883 and had 3 children: Harry Elkins Widener, George Dunton Widener Jr., and Eleanor Widener Dixon. Harry Widener, a renowned bibliophile and book collector, boarded the White Star Line's ship, the RMS Titanic, with his parents following a trip to Europe. Neither he nor his father survived the ship's April 1912 sinking. Despite this tragedy at sea, Eleanor Elkins Widener persisted with plans for the Newport, Rhode Island mansion with a view of the sea that she and her husband had commissioned from the firm of the Philadelphia-based architect Horace Trumbauer. Trumbauer had previously designed P.A.B. Widener's palatial home, Linwood Hall, and her father's home, Elstow Manor, both in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. A strong and strong-willed woman, Eleanor Elkins Widener saw to it that Miramar and Harvard University's Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library, which she funded in her son's honor at his alma mater, reached completion. Both buildings opened in 1915. Mrs. Widener's Bellevue Avenue mansion thus joined and rivaled Newport's so-called summer cottages, which were built by the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and other members of her social circle around the turn of the 20th century. Thanks to the interventions of Miramar's current owners, who purchased the property in late 2021, the mansion and its gardens have been restored, revitalized, and reimagined with a respectful nod to history and an injection of personal taste that evokes and arguably outpaces their Gilded Age glamour. Having compiled primary and secondary source materials pertaining to Miramar's original architectural, interior, and landscape design, and assisted with its historically inclined restoration over the last 4 years, my talk today centers on the central role that French architectural, interior, and garden design played in shaping Miramar at the time of its inception and creation to today. Before addressing the French influence on Miramar, a bit of background on the property's earlier Newport history. Miramar is not the first residence to call the property located at 646 Bellevue Avenue its home. When George Dunton Widener and Eleanor Elkins Widener purchased the 8-acre estate on which Miramar now stands, the land, which is situated west of Bellevue Avenue and south of Isnaga Avenue, belonged to Dr. Christopher M. Bell, who had purchased the property in 1894 and built a brick and stone, a brick and stone villa shortly thereafter. Following Dr. Bell's death in 1902, the Bell estate was leased out by his widow until the Wideners' 1911 purchase of the property, after which they decided to raise the estate's existing buildings to make way for Miramar. By 1912, the firm of the Philadelphia architect Horace Trumbauer, which, as I mentioned, designed residences in Philadelphia for the fathers of Miramar's owners, as well as the Elms, a so-called summer cottage belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Edward Julius Berwind on Bellevue Avenue, had drawn up designs for the Wideners' new Newport home. The new edifice's symmetrical H-shaped plan, visible in the 1921 Newport Atlas plate at right, constitutes a departure from the Bell House, whose irregular footprint appears in the 1907 Atlas plate at left. In a New York Times article that offered juicy details about Miramar and its opening party, which Eleanor Elkins Widener hosted on August 20th, 1915, the mansion was described as being, quote, taken from the design of a French chateau in the period of Louis XVI, unquote. Whereas the Elms, the only other Newport mansion that Horace Trumbauer's firm designed, is clearly based on the Château de Asnières, a mid-18th century building designed by Jacques-Audouin Mansart and located on the outskirts of Paris, a direct French antecedent for Miramar has proven elusive, though it has sometimes been likened to the Petit Trianon, a building on the grounds of the Domaine de Versailles that was designed by the architect Jean-Jacques Gabriel and completed in 1768. Juxtaposition of the west facade of the Petit Trianon with Miramar's west facade, which is punctuated by 3 centrally placed French doors and surmounted by a balustrade, illustrates the continuities that undoubtedly informed this comparison. More recently, Paul Miller, curator emeritus at the Preservation Society of Newport County, rightly pointed out that Miramar, but especially its east facade, closely resembles the east wing of what is now known as the Élysée Palace in Paris, which today functions as the residence of France's president. But both the appearance and architectural history of the Élysée Palace's East Wing indicate that the 1915 description of Miramar as a, quote, Louis XVI style, as in later 18th century mansion, misses the mark. Indeed, plans and elevations trace the building's architectural evolution from its inception in the early 18th century through the start of the 19th century, and reveal that the Élysée Palace's East Wing's current 2-storied presidential apartments, which comprise an east-west arm and an attached perpendicular north-south arm, did not take the form that is illustrated here until the mid-19th century, even as this wing's exterior facades are reminiscent of 16th and 17th century French architectural elements and ornamentation. The Élysée Palace began its life as the Hôtel d'Evreux, a private residence that was commissioned by Louis-Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, Comte d'Evreux, and was largely funded by the dowry of his new bride, Marianne Crozat, the eldest daughter of the famed financier Antoine Crozat. The Comte d'Evreux purchased the land on which the hôtel would be built on the Rue Faubourg Saint-Honoré in 1718. The building was designed by Armand Claude Mollet and was completed in 1722. Mollet's original elevations of the north courtyard-facing and south garden-facing facades of the building indicate that while the central part of the Hôtel Évreux constituted 3 levels, the east and west wings that abut the 3-story central body of the building were conceived as single-story arms. The upper left corner of Molet's ground floor plan of the Hôtel d'Evreux, for its part, illustrates the east wing of the Hôtel d'Evreux, that it comprised, a single row of rooms on an east-west axis, which culminated on the far east end with an outdoor space that's labeled portique de treillage, or a trellised portico. This trellised portico, which appears to include a circular fountain at far left, gives way to the Petit Jardin à Fleurs, the small flower garden that sits immediately to the south of the trellised portico and the east-west arm of the building to which the portico is adjacent. There is nothing to the east of the trellised portico or the abutting small flower garden in this plan, indicating that the north-south arm that today is perpendicular to the row of rooms on the east-west axis that culminates with the trellised portico was not a part of Molet's original plan. This configuration is corroborated by a November 1726 plan of the Hôtel d'Evreux by Pierre Convert and by the Turgot map of circa 1739, which likewise show that the east-west arm of the east wing of the Hôtel d'Evreux was still only a single story high through at least 1739. The upper left corner of the building's plan, as it appears in a version of Molet's ground floor plan that was annotated by the architect Anne-Jacques Gabriel and is dated September 24th, 1766, similarly illustrates the absence of the north-south arm of the building that today is perpendicular to the east-west arm of the building. The Hôtel d'Evreux underwent several alterations under subsequent owners following the Comte d'Evreux's death in 1753, including the Marquise de Pompadour, then King Louis XV's mistress, who acquired the property later that year. When Pompadour died in 1764, she bequeathed the property to Louis XV. The Hôtel d'Evreux's 1773 purchase by the banker Nicolas Beaujean took effect in 1774. Beaujean hired the architect Étienne-Louis Boulay to make considerable alterations to the property, which are illustrated in the upper left corner of the 1727 Molet plan that the architect Pierre-Adrien Paris annotated to reflect Boulay's modifications. Boulay transformed Molet's trellis portico in the east end of the east-west arm of the east wing into an interior space, doubled the width of the east wing's west arm, and added a single-story arm on the north-south axis that is perpendicular to the now extended single row of rooms on the east-west axis that formed a part of Molet's original plan. Boulay's addition is more clearly labeled P, Q, and R in another version of Boulay's plan that dates to circa 1798 to 1805. The room at the south end of the north-south arm, the one labeled R, is labeled in this plan as a boudoir, though it would later become the Salon d'Argent, where Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated on June 22, 1815. The Hôtel d'Evreux, which took the names Élysée Bourbon and Élysée, a reference to the Elysian Fields, in 1797, changed hands several times between Nicolas Beaujean's 1786 sale of the property to King Louis XVI and 1848, when Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, installed himself at the Élysée Palace following his presidential election in that year. It was under Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, who assumed the title Emperor Napoleon III in 1852, following an 1851 coup that resulted in the dissolution of France's Second Republic and the foundation of its Second Empire, that additional significant alterations to the Élysée Palace were made, this time under the direction of the architect Joseph-Eugène Lacroix, who completed his work on the property between 1857 and 67, or from 1850 to 70, or alternatively, between 1855 and 65, according to different sources. Two buildings to the east of the boundary of the Élysée Palace were purchased and demolished, making way for the lateral, as in eastward expansion of the north-south arm of the east wing that culminated with the Salon d'Argent. More specifically, the north-south arm of the Élysée Palace doubled in width, though the Salon d'Argent itself was left largely intact, owing to its historical significance, and a second level was added to the north-south arm and to the east-west arm, either in or after 1863. Lacroix's interventions constitute the last major changes made to the Élysée Palace's East Wing. While plans and elevations by Lacroix that convey this information visually have proven elusive, textual sources indicate that the second floor of the Élysée Palace's entire East Wing dates to this period, making it fresh for replication in the early 20th century, when Miramar was arguably made in its image. Meanwhile, the distinctive alternation of relief sculptures and windows on the mid-19th century Lacroix addition to the Élysée Palace's East Wing evokes that scene in the inner court facade of the Hôtel Carnavalet, now the home of Paris's History Museum, a building attributed to Pierre Lescaut that was begun in circa 1548 and adorned with relief sculptures depicting the seasons by the French Renaissance sculptor Jean Goujon, before undergoing subsequent renovations and additions that were undertaken by the French architect François Mansart in circa 1634 and again in circa 1655. Like the facades of the U-shaped east wing of the Élysée Palace, the facades of the Hôtel Carnavalet's U-shaped cour logis, or central courtyard, are punctuated with sculptures that constitute successive campaigns, as the relief sculptures that appear on the second level of the right wing of the Hôtel Carnavalet's central courtyard were likely added in the early 17th century, while the relief sculptures on the second level of the left wing were added by Mansart later in the 17th century. Following the fall of Napoleon III and the establishment of France's Third Republic in 1870, the Élysée Palace was reinstated as the official presidential residence in 1874. Its late 19th century status and visibility would have made it a worthy point of departure for an American architect like Horace Trumbauer, whose lack of formal training in France he remedied with a robust architectural library whose contents included numerous works on centuries' worth of French architecture. Miramar's current owner's recent acquisition of a circa 1782 cup and saucer made at France's Sèvres porcelain manufactory that featured the face of Nicolas Beaujean, the owner of the Élysée Palace from 1773 through 1786, and Beaujean's initials, respectively, gives a subtle nod to Miramar's apparent architectural antecedent. Scholarship on 18th century French architectural interiors, which inspired Miramar's many rooms, is quick to note that while 18th century buildings' exterior architecture did not change much over the course of the 18th century, interiors underwent considerable stylistic shifts in this period. Miramar is unusual among Newport's Gilded Age mansions, which include rooms whose design is drawn from a span of centuries and a range of geographical regions, in that Miramar's rooms represent distinguishable styles from different points in the same century and country. That is, from the reign of King Louis XIV around the turn of the 18th century through that of King Louis XVI during the second half of the 18th century. In broad strokes, the Louis XIV style is characterized by symmetry, straight lines, and classically inclined forms and motifs. Hallmarks of the French Régence style, which emerged during the reign of France's Prince Regent. Oh, no, we're good. We're good. I was kidding. Here we go. Okay. Just checking. Hallmarks of the French Régence style, which emerged during the reign of France's Prince Regent, Philippe II, Duc d'Orléans, who presided over France from the death of King Louis XIV in 1715 until 1723, when Louis XIV's great-grandson, King Louis XV, reached his majority and acceded the throne, include wood panels with curved, carved moldings that gracefully extend inward beyond said panels' perimeters. The Rococo style, which took hold around mid-century but is not represented by any of Miramar's ground floor rooms, likewise features curved motifs that often take the form of vegetation, whose asymmetry bespeaks the irregular, natural development of organic forms. The Louis XVI style that pervaded interiors in the second half of the 18th century constitutes a return to symmetry and classically inspired forms, albeit of a lighter variety than those that predominated during the earlier Louis XIV period. Each of these distinct styles is not, however, represented sequentially at Miramar. The three main rooms on the north-south axis in Miramar's first floor plan constitute an enfilade, an architectural feature found in 18th century French interiors that comprises a series of rooms on the same axis whose open doors allow for visual and actual access across these rooms. The dining room, which is located on the north end of Miramar's enfilade, is clad in marble with gilt bronze moldings in the late 17th to early 18th century Louis XIV style. Abutting the south end of the dining room is the Grand Salon, which is decorated with boiserie, the French term for wood paneling, whose simple, linear, gilt wood moldings and surmounting trophées allude to interiors that date to the second half of the 18th century, the Louis XVI period. The southernmost room on Miramar's enfilade is the living room, which was originally decorated with boiserie that dated to the French Régence, or Regency, period. Miramar's dining room has remained relatively intact from the time of its creation to the present day. Its marble-clad walls evoke those of the Château de Versailles, Hercules, and Diana rooms, 2 among the 7 rooms that comprise the king's state apartments in the castle that King Louis XIV famously developed as a symbol of his sprawling power and a mechanism for surveying the courtiers by whom he was surrounded. Decorated by Charles Lebrun, these rooms at Versailles were covered in marble paneling in emulation of 17th century Italian Baroque interiors. The marble that adorns Miramar's dining room was procured from a New York-based firm called Batterson C. and Eisel, which specialized in marble and stone. This now defunct firm may, earlier, have sourced these materials from France, itself the home of the interior design firm that Eleanor Elkins Widener tasked with decorating Miramar, Carlian et Cie. Headquartered in Paris and headed by Paul and André Carlian, at the time of Mrs. Widener's commission, Carlian et Cie boasted expertise in recreating historic furniture and spaces using authentic models, a practice that American proprietors like the Wideners promoted, as they were more interested in the place of their interior decor's production than they were in the period in which said decor was fabricated. Carlian et Cie worked closely with Joseph Duveen of the Duveen Brothers, a firm that specialized in supplying fine and decorative arts objects to its elite clientele, on an array of projects, including Miramar. It was the Duveen brothers that encouraged Carlian et Cie to create wall paneling that was based on Louis XVI period examples, a strategic proposal on the Duveen's part, since such wood panels boasted flat expanses of wall space that operated as unadorned and unobstructed backdrops for the works of art that the Duveens hoped to sell to the clients on whose projects the Duveen brothers and Carlian et Cie collaborated. Both Duveen and Carlian archives are held by the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. A veritable treasure trove of materials, all of the plans and elevations, as well as the historic photographs of Miramar's interiors included here today, are drawn from the Getty's rich archival resources. In this photograph of the west wall of Miramar's dining room, which is one in an album of 65 photographs of Miramar's first and second floor interiors that were taken by Robert W. Tebbs around the time of the mansion's completion, and that is now at the Getty, a marble mantelpiece is surmounted by what appears to be a 17th century bust of a male figure facing right. Notable among the works to which this sculpture bears some resemblance is the 1665 portrait of King Louis XIV that the Italian master of Baroque bombast, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, created during his brief sojourn in France, where he presented designs for the Louvre to the king, though these designs were ultimately rejected. Bernini's bust, now displayed in the Diana room, going too fast, at the Château de Versailles, features a right-facing figure with long curls whose lofty gaze is echoed by the swirling fabric on which he seems to alight, a clever conceit for the self-proclaimed Sun King who appears to float at cloud height. Miramar's current owners paid homage to the original design of the dining room's west end when they purchased a right-facing bust of a bewigged male figure with the express intention of displaying it where the bust that originally sat atop the mantelpiece appears in the photo from the album of photographs from Robert W. Tebbs. At the time of its 2022 acquisition, this sculpture was thought to be a rendering of Meinhard von Schomberg, the first Duke of Leinster, third Duke of Schomberg, and a Huguenot general that was executed in England by the Flemish-born sculptor Jan Nost. Recent research undertaken by Dr. Jeremy Warren, Honorary Curator of Sculpture at the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University and Sculpture Research Curator at the National Trust in London, has, however, revealed that the bust that now sits atop the dining room's marble mantelpiece is instead likely the work of a French workshop after a model by Antoine Coisevaux, arguably France's most important sculptor working around the turn of the 18th century. Coisevaux was himself heavily influenced by Bernini's output, a fact that is corroborated by Coisevaux's originally gilt bronze bust of Louis XIV, now housed at the Wallace Collection in London, which unabashedly insinuates the impact of Bernini's bust of the Sun King upon Coisevaux. Like Bernini's bust of Louis XIV, the French-made bust, now at Miramar, which Dr. Warren believes to be a representation of the Irishman Richard Talbot, 1st Duke of Tyrconnell, is similarly ensconced in billowing fabric whose undulations contrast with the hard armor covering the sitter's arms, and thus operate as an ode to the artist's impressive capacity to insinuate multiple materials while working primarily in a single medium. The compositional continuities across Bernini's bust of the Sun King and the present bust of an Earl and Duke arguably elevate the latter's status. A replica of Bernini's bust is currently displayed on the landing of the Grand Staircase at Marble House, the Newport cottage built by the architect Richard Morris Hunt for William Kay and Alva Vanderbilt between 1888 and 1892. It is fitting that Miramar's newly acquired, likely French-made bust is displayed in a marble-clad room at Miramar that was designed to evoke Louis XIV's marble interiors at Versailles, which are likewise invoked in similarly marble-clad spaces in nearby Newport mansions like Marble House. You see why I'm having trouble with slides. While the west wall of Miramar's dining room features a recently acquired French bust whose subject, composition, and placement refer to an object that once formed a part of Eleanor Elkins Widener's holdings at Miramar, the dining room's south wall today features an 18th century French tapestry that Mrs. Widener purchased for its present location at Miramar. This tapestry, the only object from Miramar's original collection that remains at the mansion, formed a crucial part of the 2021 negotiations that resulted in the property's sale that year. Woven at France's Royal Gobelin Manufactory under the directorship of Jean Audrin Fils between 1787 and 1794, the tapestry features two scenes drawn from Miguel de Cervantes' 17th century novel, Don Quixote de la Mancha. These scenes, the Duchess hunting on the left and Sancho Panza departing for the island of Barataria on the right, were designed by the artist Charles-Antoine Coipel, while the tapestry's now lost borders were woven after designs by Louis Tessier and Pierre-Michel Levinfos. The trompe-l'oeil carved and gilt wood frames that surround each of Coipel's narrative scenes are set against a yellow backdrop, whose color distinguishes Miramar's Don Quixote tapestry from the more common pink ground Don Quixote tapestries in the larger series of Don Quixote tapestries made in the 18th century. The Miramar tapestry's provenance is also noteworthy. Sold to Eleanor Elkins Widener by the Duveen brothers, it had previously been a gift that was bestowed upon Ludwig I, Prince of Hesse-Darmstadt, by Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte in June of 1830. Installed at Miramar soon after its purchase in 1914, Mrs. Widener's Don Quixote tapestry was loaned to the Preservation Society of Newport County by George D. Widener Jr. in 1962, before ultimately making its way back to Miramar in 2008, when it was reinstated by the mansion's then owner, David B. Ford. At that time, the tapestry was returned to its home on the south wall of Miramar's dining room and outfitted with a heavy mid-18th century Rococo-style gilt wood frame. In the fall of 2022, Miramar's current owners initiated the tapestry's removal to the Textile Conservation Lab at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, where painstaking work that resulted in reviving the tapestry's colors, particularly the golden yellow ground that had deadened owing in large part to decades of dust accumulation, was successfully undertaken. Upon its return to Miramar, the tapestry was afforded a new, later 18th century style gilt wood frame that intentionally emulates the similarly simple neoclassical style frame by which the tapestry was originally surrounded. It was also afforded an enormous, custom-made, fitted sheet-like cover, whose seasonal use mitigates the impact of additional dust and potential light-related damage, thus preserving the 18th century French tapestry for future generations. It's worth noting that while Miramar was only ever home to one tapestry from the Don Quixote series, of which a total of upwards of 175 examples were woven between 1717 and 1794, Joseph Duveen offered 4 other tapestries from this series to Eleanor Elkins Widener, who purchased them but declined to display them in her Newport home. These 4 tapestries, which boast the aforementioned pink ground on some of the many tapestry panels in this series, are now in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Eleanor Elkins Widener also purchased a different set of 5 French tapestries that decorated walls elsewhere on Miramar's first floor and in its stair hall, this time from the Parisian art dealer Jacques Seligman. Woven between November of 1741 and August of 1744 at the Beauvais Tapestry Manufactory, after a set of designs that date to circa 1739 to 40 or 41 by the renowned 18th century French artist François Boucher, each panel in this series depicts a discrete moment in the mythological story of Cupid and Psyche. A narrative in Apuleius's 2nd century AD Metamorphoses, or the Golden Ass, that was adapted into French by the French fabulist and poet Jean de La Fontaine in 1669, and subsequently turned into a tragédie ballet by the playwright known as Molière in collaboration with Pierre Corneille, Jean-Baptiste Lully, and Philippe Queneau. First performed at Palace's Palais des Tuileries in 1671, the tragédie ballet was performed on numerous occasions over the course of the first quarter of the 18th century, making it ripe for reuse in Boucher's series of tapestries featuring the same subject. In the narrative, the beautiful Princess Psyche spurs jealousy in Venus, the goddess of love, who tries to keep Psyche from love and marriage. But Venus's son Cupid falls in love with the princess, prompting a series of events in which Psyche is welcomed at Cupid's palace, only to be cast out after surreptitiously peeking at Cupid, which she had agreed never to do. Psyche endures a series of trials before ultimately reconciling with Cupid. In the first panel of the Psyche series, Psyche arrives at Cupid's palace, escorted by Zephyr, the winged god of the West. The second panel, the toilet of Psyche, shows Psyche with her attendants, perhaps in the process of preparing for her first night with Cupid, who visits Psyche nightly on the agreed-upon condition that she not lay eyes upon him and thus discover his identity. The third panel, Psyche displaying her treasures, features Psyche surrounded by treasure in the company of her sisters who, jealous of Psyche's lot, encourage her to learn the identity of her heretofore hidden lover by way of sneaking a forbidden glance at him. Psyche surreptitiously peeks at the sleeping Cupid, but hot wax from the candle that she uses to illuminate her lover falls on Cupid, causing him to awaken and subsequently to banish Psyche from his palace. Psyche's abandonment, the subject of the fourth panel in Boucher's series, shows Psyche in the aftermath of her betrayal. The fifth panel in Boucher's series, Psyche and the Basket Maker, features a distraught Psyche comforted by a basket maker and 2 female members of his family following her expulsion from Cupid's palace. This scene, which does not feature in Apuleius's ancient text, but is redolent of an episode in La Fontaine's 17th century adaptation, in which Psyche is consoled by shepherds as opposed to basket makers, relates to a recommendation by the art critic and connoisseur Louis Petit Bachemont, with whom Boucher had corresponded on the subject of his Psyche cycle. Previously owned by the 4th Marquess of Hertford and subsequently by Richard Wallace, the founder of the Wallace Collection in London, 4 of the 5 Beauvais tapestries in the complete set that was once at Miramar were bequeathed by Eleanor Elkins Widener Rice, a name that Mrs. Widener assumed following her second marriage to the medical doctor, geographer, and explorer, Dr. Alexander Hamilton Rice, to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The 5th tapestry in this group was donated to the same museum by Mrs. Rice's 2 surviving children, George D. Widener Jr. and Eleanor Widener Dixon, in 1957. The 4 tapestries that Mrs. Rice bequeathed to the museum entered the Philadelphia Museum of Art's collection in 1939 as part of a 1923 drawing room, another Trumbauer and Carlian collaboration, that was originally installed in the donor's New York City townhouse at 901 Fifth Avenue. Mrs. Rice had moved these tapestries from Newport to New York in a manner evocative of the peripatetic 17th and 18th century elites who owned tapestries like these in their own time. Prior to leaving Miramar, the 5 Psyche tapestry panels were displayed in 3 separate spaces. The first panel, Psyche's arrival at Cupid's palace, was installed on the north wall of Miramar's living room. The second and fourth panels in the series, the Toilet of Psyche and Psyche's Abandonment, were respectively installed on the south and west walls of the second level of Miramar's stair hall, which itself resembles stairwells in other 18th century French interiors, including the staircase at the Petit Trianon at Versailles, designed by first architect to King Louis XV and Jacques Gabriel. The third and fifth panels, which depict Psyche displaying her treasures and Psyche and the basket maker, respectively, were displayed on the south and north ends of the west wall of Miramar's Grand Salon. It is fitting that the first panel in the Psyche tapestry series was originally installed in Miramar's living room, since the boiserie that lined this room was the only wall paneling that actually dated to the 18th century at the time of the mansion's 1915 opening, and since said paneling is in the French Régence style, the earliest 18th century French style represented at Miramar. Sourced from an hôtel particulier on Paris's Rue de l'Université, the living room's original wall paneling features decorative carving that is in keeping with the Régence period boiserie in that it extends beyond the perimeter of each panel into its center. The wood paneling in Miramar's Grand Salon was, by contrast, fabricated by Carlian Ici in the early 20th century on the basis of later 18th century exemplars, whose linear carved wood moldings and relatively unobstructed wall panels distinguish them as Louis XVI style, though not Louis XVI period panels. The wood panels on the west wall of the Grand Salon, on which 2 scenes from the Psyche tapestry series originally hung, are replacements provided by Carlian Ici when all 5 tapestries in the series moved from Miramar to Mrs. Rice's Manhattan residence. Meanwhile, the first tapestry in the Psyche series on the north wall of Miramar's living room was replaced with a larger-than-life, high-relief rendering of what appears to be another mythological figure, Diana, goddess of the hunt, whose installation in this room was probably undertaken by Andrew Pantelakis, Miramar's owner from 1970 to 2006. By the time of Pantelakis' purchase of the property, the French Régence boiserie that had long since been removed from the mansion, though the early 20th century plaster cornice that sat atop the boiserie remained intact. In an effort to return Miramar's living room to its original Régence style, and in the absence of the room's original Régence period boiserie, Miramar's current owners procured a different set of Régence period wall panels, installing them in Miramar's living room in a deliberate attempt to honor the original spirit of this space. The recently procured Régence period and style wood paneling was supplemented with newly fabricated panels in order to accommodate the scale of the room, while the molds of the original plaster cornice were taken and used as the basis of a replica plaster cornice that surmounts the new Régence period paneling that lines this resplendent living room. The present absence of 2 mythological female figures, Psyche and Diana, has likewise been remedied by Miramar's current owners, who, in a deliberate nod to Miramar's original Psyche tapestry series, acquired a recently resurfaced set of 6 superb drawings depicting scenes from the story of Psyche by another renowned 18th century French artist, Carl Van Loo. Created in the context of a 1744 royal commission, Van Loo's drawings treat some of the same moments in the myth of Cupid and Psyche that Boucher represented in his designs for the Beauvais tapestries. At least 2 of the 6 Van Loo drawings, Cupid fleeing from Psyche and Psyche and Cupid in a chariot drawn by swans, were translated into paintings that were originally installed in the prince's wing at the Château de Versailles. Removed from Versailles in the 1780s, the paintings were reinstated in 1965, at which time they were placed in what was once the Grand Cabinet of the Dauphine Maria Josepha of Saxony on the Château's ground floor. Other objects that have recently been acquired by Miramar's current owners similarly constitute items that harken back to works of art that originally formed part of the mansion's decor. These include pieces of Sèvres porcelain. Initially displayed in inset cabinets on the north and south ends of Miramar's Grand Salon, the by then Mrs. Rice's Sèvres porcelain moved to her Manhattan apartment and was later bequeathed to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where it is currently displayed alongside her Beauvais Psyche tapestries in the period room that recreates the drawing room formerly at Mrs. Rice's Fifth Avenue residence. Additionally, recent research undertaken by Elizabeth Parker, an expert on historic carpets, has revealed that an 18th century Aubusson pile carpet that is now housed at Miramar once formed a part of Mrs. Rice's collection. It was included as lot number 117 in a June 24, 1965 auction at Paris's Palais Galliera that was dedicated to objects that were by then formerly in Mrs. Rice's collection. Given the auction's location, the carpet presumably decorated Mrs. Rice's Paris apartment. The carpet that once belonged to Mrs. Rice has found its way to Miramar, depicts an eagle in a central roundel set on a green ground whose punctuation with repeating motifs comprising pink and white acanthus leaves is redolent of Miramar's original gardens. Designed by the French landscape architect Jacques Rebet, who would later design the gardens at Linwood Hall, P.A.B. Widener's palatial property in the outskirts of Philadelphia, as well as the parterre of the sunken garden at the Elms here in Newport, Miramar's west parterre included two rectangular sections featuring scrolling broderie or embroidery patterns composed of carefully cut and manicured vegetation. These embroidery-like panels flanked a central allée that constituted an uninterrupted vista from the mansion's west facade to the fountain near the western border of the property near Bellevue Avenue. The fountain, for its part, included 3 bronze sculptures by Jacques Rebet's father, the sculptor Henri-Léon Rebet, a central sculpture of a standing nereid ensconced between 2 semi-submerged river gods, and 2 flanking sculptures of cherubic children astride dolphins. Another smaller embroidered garden, known as the Rose Garden, was placed in front of the west facade of the so-called Carriage House, a building on Miramar's grounds that is located to the mansion's north and functioned as a garage and laundry facility in Mrs. Widener's time. Jacques Rebet's design for Miramar's parterre was clearly inspired by French formal gardens, such as those on the grounds of the Château de Versailles, that the landscape architect André Le Nôtre designed at the behest of King Louis XIV in the 17th century. Characterized by symmetry, long allées that give way to expansive vistas, and complicated patterns achieved with curated and controlled plant life, Le Nôtre's designs demonstrated the king's capacity to control nature, thus aggrandizing his power. Miramar's original gardens were a tour de force translation of French landscape design, the property's pièce de résistance, whose high maintenance upkeep was abandoned a few decades following the Gilded Age, but reinstated by its current owners, whose passion for Miramar's multi-layered past laid the groundwork for the recent restoration of the mansion and its once again glorious grounds. Thank you.
Then we have to do a reset for our next presentation.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's been a lot of interest in social media circles on the parterre gardens. And the question that's often asked is whether the gardens that are there now are a replica of what originally existed, or whether there have been modifications to the design. If you could speak to that, that'd be wonderful.
Sure. The parterre is very close to the original parterre. It actually, used the photographs, one of which you saw a few slides ago, as the basis of it. However, the current owner's taste was, of course, taken into account. Other things that were taken into account, of course, were Newport's climate. Salty sea air, I have learned, not great for curly hair and not great for plant life, as it turns out. But beyond that, I'm no plant expert. I can say, though, that Jeffrey Bosch, who's seated right here in front of me, of Whitmore's, and who's recently worked on a few properties in Newport, most notably the Breakers, or I should say most recently the Breakers, would certainly be able to answer more about how more recent iterations of gardens like the one at Miramar have been instated.
Thank you so much, Margot.
Thank you.
We need to reset the stage, so we don't have time for one question, but thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Margot, for that incredible lecture. I am quite exhausted trying to figure out the complexities of what has taken place at Miramar. I'm Pauline Metcalf, a longtime Rhode Islander who have studied various artists here, from Edith Wharton and Ogden Codman, and I've been quite familiar with a number of these buildings that we're looking at today. Miramar's presence on Bellevue Avenue is hard to match, but on the opposite end of the avenue sits another of Horace Trumbauer's great masterpieces, the Elms. The two buildings, as we learned, are quite similar, but one of the most distinctive differences of the Elms interiors is that they were created by Jules Allard and Fils. The Preservation Society has been aware of Allard's contributions to its interiors at the Elms, the Breakers, Marble House, and here at Rosecliff. Curator Emeritus Paul Miller led an intensive study of Allard, bringing forward previously unknown information about the overlooked man, his family, and cabinet-making firm, which shed light on just how important Allard's contributions were to Gilded Age America. This work is being built upon by a new generation of scholars, and today we have the pleasure of hearing from them for their research. Fellow Théo Laurenceau and another research fellow, Laura Bergman, in conversation with the Preservation Society's Director of Museum Affairs and Curator Leslie Jones. Théo Laurenceau, excuse my pronunciation, attended the Ecole du Louvre in Paris, where he earned a diploma of the first cycle, magna cum laude, a diploma of museum studies, summa cum laude, and a master's degree in museum studies. His qualifying dissertations were on the Louvre, the Encyclopedic Museum, and the study of the Pavillon des Sessions and the Museum in Debate, and many other aspects of the decorative arts exhibitions there. He served as the assistant curator for an upcoming exhibition, Louvre-Lens, and was a chief contributor to the Preservation Society's recent exhibition, Richard Morris Hunt, which is still available to see now. Laura Bergman received her BS in chemistry from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, another Master of Science degree in conservation from NYU, and received a National Endowment for the Arts for the Humanities Fellowship. Laura has held several internship and professional roles, including work at the Museum Conservation Institute, Smithsonian Institute, in Indianapolis Museum, the Frick Collection, and Sotheby's. She recently served as the Preservation Society's conservation intern studying the interiors of Allard et Fils, and is currently pursuing her doctorate at Vanderbilt University. Leslie Jones has served as the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator for the Preservation Society since 2019. Prior to that, she held professional and fellowship roles at the Smithsonian in various guises, the White House Historical Association, the Cheekwood Estate, and the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, Australia. She was co-author of the book titled Cheekwood, and is now working on the forthcoming first ever collections catalog for the Preservation Society in 2027. The type of scholarship that we're hearing today by qualified scholars reflects the hopes and determinations for whom this session is named, Ralph Carpenter. Ralph founded the Newport Symposium in 1993, hoping it would bring together collectors, decorators, scholars, curators, and enthusiastic members of the public to join in celebrating and advancing the study of decorative arts. Now, 32 years later, we are continuing Ralph's vision with the revitalization of the Newport Symposium. Ralph's spirit is here with us today, and I hope that his contributions will be remembered and offer inspiration to this next generation of museum talent as they pursue this study. Jules Allard offers one of the most direct collaborations between France and Newport during the Gilded Age. I'm now pleased to turn it over to Leslie, Laura, and Theo to share more of what they have learned about this wonderful association. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Wonderful, thank you. Pauline, thank you so much for that introduction. And I want to make specific mention, while this session is named for Ralph Carpenter, it's because of the generosity of the Newport Symposium Committee. And I just want to again acknowledge, following Trudy's remarks, how important this committee is to us. So I want to thank the members who are here today, both in person as well as online. It's been a true honor to help revive this really important program for the Preservation Society. But we are now going to speak about Jules Allard, who has become one of my favorite people in Newport history, mostly because of how elusive he is and how I think he wanted to be kept elusive too. Allard, as Pauline said, has been known to us for many decades, considering his contributions to our several of our homes. But Jules Allard, as an idea and as a person, are two things we need to distinguish. So Jules Allard was born to Célestin Allard, who already had a very prolific cabinet-making workshop in Paris. And he inherited that firm and took it from being a well-known and well-respected house of design and production into a global empire. Jules Allard later turned his firm into Jules Allard et Fils, incorporating his sons, and in particular Fernand, one of his sons, who essentially took on the American side of business. He was becoming so prolific in the US that they needed a firm sort of headquarters in New York City, which Fernand, as from what we understand research-wise, helped to develop. In fact, we haven't seen much evidence of Jules Allard coming to the United States. It's more so Fernand Allard who's making these great voyages across the Atlantic. The company becoming sort of a global empire really represents sort of the importance of what France as a cultural and artistic development center was at the end of the 19th century. We, of course, have here on our properties the breakers, to your right, Marble House, top left, and the Elms, bottom left, and of course here at Rosecliff, as Pauline mentioned. So take it all in right now. We're having our French Symposium in an Allard design space, the largest ballroom, of course, in Newport as well. And again, this work was started by Paul Miller, our curator emeritus, also a tremendous amount of work by our former chief conservator, Jeff Moore, on the scientific study of these spaces, which Laura has picked up on. We've also had research fellows in the past who have specifically focused on Allard, in particular Ben Bowery, who sort of inaugurated this intensive work that we're doing now. Ben did a survey and created a sort of a design compendium of what distinguishes Allard's designs from his contemporaries, so that we can develop a connoisseurship perspective on identifying what Allard is. Because as you see here on the screen, There are some instances where his name appears and he has purposefully signed pieces, but that is incredibly rare and never shows up on furniture. So being able to tell from a proportion perspective and a cabinet-making perspective what we can identify as Allard is incredibly important so that we know where some of these unknown pieces may exist. In particular, friends of ours who have Allard pieces in their collection, such as the Ringling Museum, who's here with us today. So Ben began this study in 2022. We've continued this research through 23, and our first presentation of this research in 2023, thanks to Théo's work in Paris. I'm not gonna speak for him then, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get into some of the questions we have for Théo and Laura to again update us on where we are in this Allard process. So first, Théo, would you talk to us a little bit about your research of Allard and how it began?
Absolutely. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So there are two things to have in mind when it comes to researching Allard. The first one is that here at the Preservation Society, we don't have archival material related to Allard. So no receipts, no contracts, no letters. So really there was this idea that we as an institution needed to search somewhere else, and somewhere else was France, right? It was very convenient that I was studying in France, and that's why I was hired at first. Now, even in France, Allard archives are not centralized. That means that there is not a Jules Allard file that we can just study from the National Archives, for example. So really all of that is assembling a big puzzle, right? Except that not only we need to assemble the pieces, we need also to find the pieces. I remember that when we started, one of the very first piece of information that we had was that Allard was awarded the Legion of Honor in 1878 after the World's Fair in Paris. And one of the very first important documents that I found was actually Allard's application letter that he wrote and submitted to the minister in France. He gave a lot of details about his career in this letter, and so I was able to find more collections of archives based on that and so on, essentially.
Laura?
So when I joined the Preservation Society last year as a fellow, I was coming off the tales of Ben Bowery's research into Allard's furniture and Théo's research into Allard's life in France and subsequent journey here in New York and in Newport. So when I joined, we switched our focus from looking at solely Allard's furniture, but more to his greater contributions in the rooms themselves, and that specifically pertains to the boiserie or the wall paneling that characterize many of his spaces, including this space in this room. As a conservation fellow, my background is in understanding materials themselves, and as Théo mentioned, we don't have archival materials for Allard here in Newport. So instead, we have to read the rooms as a document and understand what they tell us about his materials and methods. Within the conservation department, we had sort of a tripartite approach to understanding these rooms, which first start with their construction. So what are these spaces made out of? Their condition, how have they changed over time and over different ownership? And finally, using those two pieces, confirmation. We had specific prior research that suggested to us that Allard actually incorporated architectural salvage, so pieces from older houses, most notably pieces from aristocratic residences in France, and reutilized those as parts of the boiserie in these spaces. And we wanted to be able to scientifically confirm those through the conservation information we were obtaining as part of my fellowship.
So in obviously having the resources of the physical spaces, which is important, and knowing that there's no central location of Allard material, Théo, can you speak a little bit more to, as you mentioned, the French National Archives, what other types of resource locations were central to your work as a French Heritage Society intern in Paris for the Preservation Society?
So I was able to find Allard materials in multiple public repositories in France. So that includes, of course, the National Archives, but also the Paris City Archives, even the library at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, also the Archives départementales du Var in the south of France, because Allard died in 1907 near Saint-Raphaël, and this is where his will was established. I would say an important moment for the study of Allard in France was when I studied the collections of Allard's notaries. So first we had to identify who are the notaries, and then going through their registers at the National Archives in Paris, we're essentially able to find very relevant information, including all the details about the founding and the transformation of his business. So, for example, in France, from Allard et Chopin in the 60s, essentially, to Jules Allard fils in the 70s, and essentially in the 90s, Jules Allard et ses fils, so with his two sons, Georges and Fernand. Studying also contemporary newspapers gave a lot of depth to the study, essentially giving information about his most important commissions, his workers, his factory. So really, that gave us a good understanding of who was Allard and what he was doing. Now, I would also add that last year, I was very happy to come to Newport for the fellowship on Richard Morrison's. And it also became clear that there are Allard documents here in America, however, in repositories that don't have Allard names on them, obviously. So here is a great example. It's a plan for the first floor of Marble House from the Hunt collection at the Library of Congress. And as you can see, we have attribution of spaces to Allard. So we will talk about that later, but we believe that that's pretty much the future of the Allard survey, to really identify those repositories or those institutions with potential Allard materials. And so that includes, for example, here in Newport, Salve Regina University with the Garlett family papers related to the construction of Ocker Court, or even the Newport Historical Society, thank you, with papers related to the construction of the breakers.
Yeah, so it is fascinating to think about how, well, first, I guess one of the questions, too, to ask and answer for ourselves is, why is Allard important? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that in order to create these spaces, it makes an international dialogue, and it sets Newport in its own categories, separate from New York and Boston and Washington, D.C., where we know Allard has also done other work. We're not a crossroads of those particular places. We are our own specific destination, and because we have so much retained and work on it, it is important for us to lead that type of study. And Laura, from the physical spaces, these are also, as you mentioned, documents. So give us a sense of where you had to look and how you looked at these particular locations.
So over the course of the past year, I looked at 4 rooms in 2 separate houses that we know are attributed to Allard. Those are namely the ladies' reception room and the breakfast room at the Breakers, and the drawing room and the ballroom at the Elms. Now, when we come to our highlights portion of what we've learned about these spaces, I'll only be discussing the ladies' reception room. But it's really important to note that all 4 of these spaces contributed immensely to our understanding of how Allard creates his spaces, the methods and the materials that he employs to do so. What's important for understanding my research is we're also looking at this from a scientific perspective. And to that end, there are 2 tools that I really used very heavily in understanding the construction and the condition of these rooms. The first is ultraviolet illumination. This is also known as UV light, or you may be familiar with it as black light. Ultraviolet light is a specific type of light which helps us distinguish between different materials that may not be immediately visible to us in visible illumination. So here I'm showing you a representative panel from the Elms Ballroom, which on the screen and in real life looks pretty much white and cream all the way around. But when we turn the ultraviolet illumination on, which is in the shape of a flashlight, you can see that there are slightly different colors that appear on the same panel. We're seeing a blue fluorescent area that's a sort of light blue color. That is indicative of a 19th century oil-based paint, which we can attribute in this case to Allard's application in 1901. And in contrast, we're also seeing areas that are sort of a dark gray, maybe a light brown color. That is a later overpaint addition that was added at some point in the 20th century when the house was still occupied. And so in this case, we're using UV to distinguish between what's old and what's newer in these spaces. The other key tool as part of my survey in these spaces was the use of cross-section sampling. Cross-section sampling involves taking a small piece of the wall finish, in this case paint or gilding, off of the surface, mounting it in a resin stub, and looking at that under the microscope. So here you can see the full process of me taking a sample, that representative sample in its resin stub in my hand, so you can see that these are quite small, and then under the microscope. In this case, what we're looking for is not just the current finish on the wall, but we actually flip the sample on its side. So we're looking at all prior finishes, and we're fully understanding the history and the condition of these spaces through its representative stratigraphy. In this case, we also use UV under the microscope to help distinguish and delineate between different kinds of paints and finishes and the representative ages, and that helps us also draw connections between what was Allard applied, what was potentially applied after Allard, and in some cases, what was applied before Allard even got to some of these spaces.
So playing with very fun tools, which I know is your specialty, Laura, can you share with us some of the highlights of what you discovered as a part of this process? And Laura, I'm going to start with you since we're right here, if that's okay.
Okay. I will skip through a few slides, so please hold your anticipation for Teo. So I'll just mention what's happening in the ladies' reception room, and this is the representative east wall. And if you come on my tour later today, which I hope to see some of you there, you'll be able to enjoy this space within the room itself. So as I mentioned, prior research into this room suggested that there is architectural salvage in this space, and we're actually quite fortunate to know the provenance, and some of the panels are believed to have come from the Hotel Maigret de Sailly, which is a aristocratic residence that was built in 1778 inside Paris proper, and it still stands today, although it doesn't have any of its historic interiors, because some of them have been transported to different institutions, including the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and through my close technical study, we've been able to confirm that there are indeed panels from the Hotel de Sailly in the ladies' reception room. When we look at this diagram, those are labeled out in the red colors here, and those we attribute to the 18th century carver Gilles Cauvet at Maigret de Sailly, the Hotel Maigret de Sailly. In contrast, the panels that are marked out in blue here, we attribute to Allard. So he did make panels for this space, and those constitute about 60% of the paneling we see in this space, whereas the 18th century panels constitute about 30%. Now, we were expecting to see this mixture of 18th and 19th century materials within the room itself, but what was quite surprising to us in the ladies' reception room are these purple panels, which consist of about 10% of the room paneling. These are panels that contain 18th and 19th century materials on the same substrate, which we were not expecting to see at all. And I'll discuss how we were able to discover that shortly. But first, just information about how we understand what's 18th century and what's 19th century in the room. I'm showing you representative panels from the north wall and the west wall, and I'll draw your attention to the north wall panel first. Hopefully you can see on the screen that there are parallel striations that run up and down the entire length of the board. It's important to note that when these panels were installed in 1895, we do not expect that these striations would have been as apparent as they currently are in the room. But regardless, when they are visible to us, they are a very important clue that this is an 18th century construction, because what we're looking at is a series of joined boards that abut each other and then are glued together to create that one surface across which the decoration can be applied. In contrast, when we look at that west wall panel, it is very smooth, and in the room, it is incredibly smooth. What we're actually seeing is a 19th century sort of proto-plywood construction, where there are still joined wood boards, but they are actually sandwiched between sheets of veneer that create this very smooth surface. This sort of proto-plywood construction we attribute to Allard himself. And then I'll return to these curiosity panels. This is one of these hybrid panels. It's an overdoor. And at first glimpse, it appears to be an Allard construction because it is very smooth and it has that plywood backing. However, in contrast to almost every other panel in the room where the decoration is carved in or glued on, this carved and gilded decoration is nailed into the board itself. This is a very important clue, as it suggests that the board and the carving are not created by the same individual. And in fact, with the cross-section that I took from this particular sample, we're able to confirm that underneath the current gilding layer, which we know was applied in 1895 by Allard, there's another fragmentary gilding layer sitting underneath, which we believe was applied by the woodcarver Gilles Cauvet in 1778, or perhaps another individual if these panels or this decoration is not, in fact, from the Hôtel de Saint-Elie. So in this case, we can see that Allard actually took this decoration, stripped it, re-gilded it, and reused it for the ladies' reception room. One final note is that when I started my fellowship, it was believed that only the ladies' reception room had any reused architectural salvage within its boiserie. Having looked at all 4 spaces and some additional spaces within the different houses that are owned by our Newport Mansion Society, in fact, every room that I've looked at that's been attributed to Allard contains architectural salvage. So it is not a unique technique. In fact, this was pervasive. This was a signature technique of Allard. And indeed, any space that we attribute to him, we should be looking for architectural salvage and reuse and adaptation of older materials.
Excellent. We'll backtrack a little bit. I'm sorry I got out of order. I had to keep hearing from you, Laura. We'll go back to Theo to give us some insight, again, from some of the, in general, the wonderful discoveries you made as a part of your archival research.
Absolutely. So I don't want to keep you hostage with hours of Allard facts. So just to make it clear, I believe that one of my main contributions was really to bring the idea that Allard means more than just one person. As Leslie mentioned in the introduction, Jules Allard was really set for success. His father, Célestin, was a very well-established cabinet maker in Paris. He was, for example, an exhibitor at the first World Fair in London. It also became clear through his inventory, established in 1854, that Célestin Allard was already shipping products in Egypt, even in Uruguay. So really, as I mentioned, Allard was set for success, and I don't even mention more personal connections to French intellectuals, I would say. Now, when it comes to Jules Allard himself, most of the information that I found in France inform us about his work in France in the 70s and in the 1880s. So once again, it became clear that he was really a leading figure of the cabinet maker industry in Paris, as suggested not only by the variety of his commissions for private apartments, transatlantic liners, or even warships, but also, testimonies, does that make sense? Yeah, description of his personality. I would also add that Jules Allard was really a transitional figure, and that's why he's so important and interesting for us. He brought steam engines in his workshops in Paris. He added a bronze foundry in his workshop in Paris. And he also understood that he needed to expand his branch internationally. And that's how we arrive here in Newport, right? So he was an exhibitor in Philadelphia in 1876. In 1878, he is the installator of the American exhibition during the World Fair in Paris. And at the same time, he is working for the Vanderbilt in New York City. And on the screen right now is maybe one of my favorite documents ever. It's an advertisement for Jules Allard Fils, written both in French and in English. And this advertisement essentially was in an album that essentially was installed or like available on the transatlantic liners. So these wealthy Americans that traveled back and forth between America and France would be able to see his advertisement. Now, the big question for our mentions, they are built in the 1890s when it comes to Allard here in Newport, even early 20th century. If I go back to the first document that I mentioned, the application letter of Allard in 1878, well, Allard is expressing that he is about to retire. So really, what does that mean? That's 7 years before he opened a branch in New York City in 1885. So we believe that we have now enough evidence really to think that the New York branch was actually the business of his two sons, Georges and Fernand, and essentially that Fernand was really acting as the head designer here in the United States. So this suggestion, this is suggested, for example, by Fernand Allard's own application for the Legion of Honor, where he is credited for the design of numerous mansions for the Vanderbilt stores here in the United States.
So obviously we've done quite a lot thus far in terms of understanding physical elements of Allard's productions, trying our best to create a almost like our own sourcing for all of the materials that exist in archives. So I guess the big question is, what happens next? This work isn't going anywhere. We want to make sure that we help elevate Allard's stature, because as they're discussing too, the ultimate question that we can't answer right now is, why has Allard fallen into irrelevance? Why has he not been maintained as this great name in essentially communicating French interiors to America, but also in France himself? So what work do we have in the next steps? Not the final destination, but the next steps of your projects and your focus.
As I mentioned earlier, I think right now really the most important is our ability to make connections with more institutions. So we are very excited right now to work with Clifton in England, with Agnières in France, with the Ringling in Florida. That's what we need to do to expand this survey. Yeah, the most important aspect when we do this kind of work really is to establish connections between places, events, and people. I would also add, from the Preservation Society's perspective, it's also very exciting that Allard will feature the upcoming collections catalog, and I'm very also happy to be part of this adventure.
And from my end, I'm very excited to be back in Newport, because this offers me the opportunity to pick up some of the 250 cross-sections that I created over the past year. They will be coming back with me to Vanderbilt University, where I'm currently within the Department of Engineering. And some of these cross-sections will go into the machine that you see on the screen, which is our Zeiss Merlin SEM within our core imaging facility. So this will allow us to understand not only when and how the materials that Allard used were applied in the rooms, but also give us a deeper scientific understanding of what they're actually made of. And as we mentioned, Allard is a transitional figure in between this classical period and this industrial period of aesthetic creation. And I have some theories about what we're expecting to see through our scientific research and our continuing historic research within these spaces. So please stay tuned for more Allard updates.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
All right, Kate has the microphone if anyone has any questions. See, oh, there's lots. Okay, I'm not gonna.
Really interesting. I was wondering, when you go to explore from the 18th century to the 19th century, and my understanding is that the colors of the fabrics and the beads would be significantly different because of techniques like they're using now that we're able to do a lot more accurate interpretation of what actually was, as opposed to what we think it was.
Right. I will be discussing this if anyone is coming on my tour later this afternoon. I'll just plug it again. I'd love to see you. I'll be discussing some of the color changes that we see over time. It's important to note that each space is its own space, and so there's a lot of nuance. And the choice for a room like this may not be the proper choice for the room next door. So we're going room by room. My fellowship was one of the first forays into how we'll think about conserving these spaces in the future. And the ladies' reception room, as we heard it, is actively being treated now. We're dealing with, we're starting cleaning tests to understand what the finishes actually look like under some layers, many layers of aging, and also doing some slight repairs to any losses of gilding and things like that. But there's a much longer conversation to be had about where we'd like to go. Now, it's, to be fair to these spaces, they didn't exist in the 18th century. They exist now because of Allard's creation in the 19th century. So I think that would be the goal, is to think about the 19th century. However, we need to be careful. We can't make all the changes that we'd like to make, because it's important to note that there are materials that are 250 years old and 130 years old in the ladies' reception room, and there's also been some restoration in there, so there are even younger materials. So really what we're hoping for is something that takes care of all of them and treats them as equally valuable. We don't want to sacrifice any material for the sake of another. And it's also important to note that I was here housed in the Department of Conservation, which has fabulous staff. They will make an exceptional choice for each of these rooms. It's not to worry. The rooms will look amazing today and tomorrow and far into the future.
And just to add on to that too, with the particular choices that get made per room, This is where their combined efforts work so beautifully, because what we can find scientifically also has to have an understanding of human decision-making and as to why. Because what she might find as the earliest layer in a room may have another layer directly on top of it, and the question is why. Was it done in the initial plan by the Allard studio, and then the owners came in and said they didn't like it and changed it right away and lived with that color for the longest period? So having more anecdotal information from archives is absolutely essential before we make those kinds of decisions.
Thank you so much for that, and the addition of science to art here is very interesting. Obviously, these panels need to be as dimensionally stable as possible, given rises and drops in humidity. Was Allard experimenting with different types of wood? And I thought I heard mention that perhaps there were even prototypes of plywood, which has become a ubiquitous material throughout the world, and that would certainly be a very fascinating start to that material story.
Yes, so as has been mentioned a few times, Newport is right on the ocean, and we do experience all 4 seasons. So stability is a key component in understanding how we take care of these spaces for the future. Yes, based on Theo's research into Allard's workshop in Paris, and we also know he had a factory in New York, we know that they had access to many, many different types of industrial tools. So they were making this sort of proto-plywood type board, and Allard was very much experimenting with what was going to work. I think part of this is because he knew his designs were going to be shipped across the Atlantic, a period that could take a month to 3 months, depending on how quickly things were going to happen, and also that they were going to be installed on a tight deadline by not him. Also, it's important to note that Fernand Allard is the person who's here in Newport, we think, but he's only here 6 to 8 months out of the year. We have evidence that Jules Allard only came to the United States twice, and that's thanks to Theo's research as well. So the people installing these panels had potentially never seen them until they got uncrated here on the floor of the ballroom in Rosecliff. So imagine that the telegrams going back and forth about the potential confusion. But also, your question brings up something interesting. Allard knew that his materials were going to be exponentially younger than the other materials that he was incorporating into the spaces. And we actually see that he took that into account. We see efforts of restoration on the backs of the older architectural salvage pieces. So attempts to make them look younger, attempts to give them a new life. And that is very interesting to us too, that there was understanding that these pieces are old, but they can live again, and how can we make them all adapt together for a brand new space that these older panels were not designed for, as many of them are coming to us from Paris. So.
So when you're at the Elms and the tops from the ceiling fall short, they extend the paint. When they're doing the chinoiserie, when they're short of panels, in order to make symmetry, they do chinoiserie. So when you're looking at Jules Allard and Sons, are you not also looking at Jules Allard and a team of trained artisans that are creating all of these things? And does our research include who are these?
We are attempting to do that from the get-go. Actually, one of our first sort of tasks to Theo as a French Heritage Society intern in Paris was if you can also find any information on anyone associated with the firm, particularly who held positions there, would be incredibly helpful. Not so much discovered in Paris, but there is a collection in the New York archive system that is from one of his American carpenters or talents from the firm that does detail some of the work that was done for New York houses. So that was a fabulous find, but it's incredibly rare. And it is something that we have to bear in mind that these individuals weren't necessarily thinking about us, reflecting back on them 100+ years later, so they didn't keep a lot of those materials. And we're doing our best through very unconventional ways to discover that information. And sometimes that comes through an obituary. Sometimes that comes through census data. A lot of times it's not going to come from the actual firm's own records, but through our sort of navigating what we know is publicly accessible. And also saying it out loud on a stage and a microphone that if you know anything about Jules Allard, please don't keep it to yourself. Please share it with the Preservation Society.
Please
yes, we have email
us.
addresses. If you suspect that something looks like it's Allard, please contact us. If you see Fernand Allard, what did Fernand go by again? I forget his, he had a nickname. What was his nickname?
Yeah.
Somebody said it. René.
If
you see René
Well, that's one of
Allard.
his middle names. So if you hear Fernand René Victor Allard, that's our guy.
Yes.
We're looking for him. And his brother Georges.
Yes, there is another Jules Allard that's from Canada, from later periods, so we don't care. Send it our way. We'll look at it. We'll either rule it out or include it. But it is work that has taken not only dedicated, thoughtful experiments, but also, I mean, cold calls. As a reminder to all of you, Mr. Berwin's bedroom furniture, created by the Allard firm, came to us through a cold call I got from a gentleman in Colorado. So the furniture left Newport, went to Massachusetts, and then somehow made its way to Aspen, and now has returned. So I will always return your voicemail if it says Allard in it. Put it that way.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Not to worry, there's lunch after this, which is also why we have our food lecture to close out our speaking portion of the day. I just want to again thank Theo and Laura and all of our research fellows for the incredible work that they do here. The fellowship program is so important to the Preservation Society. It really does allow us to ensure that the importance of Newport's collections, its history, its people, is recognized by another generation of individuals who can help build upon that information and that history going forward. That's the best way for us to be able to sustain the continued work here, not only of our professional staff, but also of our peers in other capacities at other institutions. I'm pleased to be the individual to introduce our next presenter, Becky Liberal-Diamond. Becky's lecture is French Flavors of the Gilded Age, which is very appropriately sponsored by our generous contributor, Russell Morin Catering and Events, who is also doing the wonderful food here today. And I'm assuming they chose this because their favorite subject is food, so that's very appropriate. Becky is a food writer, a librarian. Thank you for being a librarian. Librarians are so important. And a research historian. And her most recent book, The Gilded Age Cookbook, blends Gilded Age details and celebrity stories with historic menus and recipes, updated for modern kitchens. We do also have some copies of Becky's various books for sale outside, if you're interested. A similar book focusing on the holidays, the Gilded Age Christmas Cookbook, is slated for a September 2025 launch. In fact, I think it did launch. It's outside. Hot off the presses. Your Christmas shopping is finished. She also is the author of The $1,000 Dinner and Mrs. Goodfellow, The Story of America's First Cooking School. Becky holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from Rider University and a Master of Library Sciences from Rutgers. She has worked as the business librarian at Rutgers, New Brunswick since 2020. Her current project is a history of Philadelphia's famous City Tavern restaurant. And while she lives in Yardley, Pennsylvania, we are very happy to have her here in Newport today. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Becky to the stage. Becky.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I get the honor of being right before lunch, and I'm talking about food, so I am going to whet your appetites. And so the cookie that you have, I'm going to talk about it a little later in the lecture, but it's Château de Milan, and it is French, and if anyone has allergies, I think mainly it has eggs in it. butter, milk, flour, the usual suspects, but there aren't any nuts or anything. So, so here we go. We're going to talk about food in the French food influence in the Gilded Age. And Leslie, thank you for the lovely introduction. These are the 4 books that I've written, and I've been writing about food since about 2010. I love doing research as a librarian, and I love writing, so combining the two is my dream. And I really have gotten into this 19th century period with food. I just find it fascinating. And then one book has built upon the other. The $1,000 Dinner really got me, really boosted my knowledge of what French dining would have been like at that time frame, because even though it takes place in 1851, it was really kind of a precursor to all this Gilded Age excessiveness. It was 17 courses that took place over 12 hours. So the gentleman got there at 6 in the evening, did not leave till 6 in the morning. And every chapter is a course, and I just learned so much writing that book. And it really led me to the next 2 books, Gilded Age Cookbook and the Gilded Age Christmas Cookbook, because I was starting to blog about these recipes, and I really wanted to deconstruct them. Because you can't just take a 19th century recipe and make it the way that it's written at all. First of all, they're usually written in paragraph form. The measurements are different. They talk about dessert spoonfuls and wine glassfuls of things. So you have to really go through and do that due diligence of what these measurements were. And so that's what I did for those 2 cookbooks. But let's go into what French influence would have been. And this is a dining table, for a banquet that would have been at that time frame. And so French culture and society really dominated the Gilded Age, and specifically here in America. And many dishes featured rich butter sauces, cream sauces, elaborate pastries, and gâteaux were really popular desserts. And you also had things, French words that started to really enter American language, like restaurant, menu, cafe, a la. And so then you just start to see that in everyday language, and especially on menus. And the French word menu actually did replace the term bill of fare in a lot of cases. So you would see menu instead of bill of fare in describing basically a menu, what we think of today. And then you also had dining evolved. Again, I found out so much about this in the $1,000 Dinner, is that it was evolving from the à la Française style, which means the French style of dining, where everything is kind of laid out on the table, to dining à la Russe, and that's the Russian style of dining, where things are presented sequentially in courses, like that we're used to now, and either a waiter's bringing them out if you're in a restaurant, or servants in one of these homes here in Newport. And, oops. So this is a typical Newport menu from Society as I Have Found It by Ward McAllister. Many of you probably remember him as being, dictating the 400 with Mrs. Astor, the list of people that could come to a lot of parties in the Gilded Age. And you can start to see, this is from that 1890 book, and you start to see a lot more French in menus. This is entirely in French. And understanding and pronouncing French words really signaled that you had social status, you were refined, you were educated. The French labeling made it actually sound more refined in a lot of ways. It was more elegant, more appetizing when it was written in French and spoken that way. And the upper class really did embrace this trend to display cultural prestige. So that was kind of their thing. They really wanted to do that. Now, this is actually a breakfast menu. I did want to start with that because they were starting to do breakfast menus. And this is from the Ocean House Hotel, which is right here in Newport. It was on Bellevue Avenue and Bowery Street. And this was from 1881. You see mostly American foods and some British foods as well, but there is some French influence there as well. Like you see things like veal côtelettes, and those are tender veal cutlets that are breaded. Omelettes, there's 6 different ones on this menu. stewed dishes. It's funny, the one thing I found too is that breakfast then was much more savory. There wasn't like the sweet pastries and things so much that we think of today that for breakfast you have stewed dishes like tripe with onions, wine, and herbs in the Leon style. You also have kidneys en Madeira, so kidneys with that Madeira sauce. So you're seeing things with sauces that's so inherent in French cooking, you know, all the sauces, it's very central, and you're even seeing that at breakfast. They're having all these really nice sauces with the foods, even at breakfast, and of course during other times as well. It was really viewed as a culinary art form to have these sauces with foods. Now, this is a daily menu from that same hotel, same year, 1881. And believe it or not, it says on the back of this menu that the dinner was served at 3, and then tea would have been from 7 to 9, and then supper, as they called it, was 9 to 11. So this is actually the dinner menu. And you see many items in French here. You see potage, which is soup. You see poisson, fish, relevés. I'm going to talk about all these in a little bit. Cold dishes, entrees, they're all at the beginning part of the menu. And then the latter part, you see the roast, you see vegetables, you see pastries and dessert. There's fewer French references there, but there are a few. You're starting to see a little more of an acceptance of American foods, actually. There were several people, in fact, that James Parkinson, who I wrote about in the $1,000 dinner, he loved cooking French and he did it quite a bit, but he was also trying to incorporate some American foods along with the French at the same time. So you really start to see that more too. And then of course the wine list here is really, you know, so many French wines there. And now this is actually a banquet menu from that same hotel again, but it's from 1898. And you see a similar order of dishes here, a few less French items, but because what you start to see, like I said, with the American foods, you see things like Rhode Island spring duckling. So you will see American foods on there. But it does have what's called a coup du milieu, and that is a midway pause that always happened before the net, like after the roast, before all the rich dishes that came after that. And it was a way to refresh your palate, to kind of prepare yourself for all the dishes to come. And it might be a rum sorbet or even a glass of room temperature spirits, sherry, also Roman punch. That was one that was served on this menu, and that would have been like citrus, flavored with rum, and then it often had a meringue topping on it, actually. That's what made it special as a Roman punch. And now this was actually a dinner at Rosecliff from 1905 by Mrs. Herman Ulrichs, and it was for 150 guests, which I find that's got to be so, how much, you know, to pull that off. It just must have been huge. But I did want to mention, so this is, you know, a printed menu. So in the Gilded Age, printed menus really became formal, you know, at these dinners. It was a standard thing to have, you know, these formal menus that everyone would get to look at when they came in, because earlier, when you had that a la Francaise style, the dishes were often announced aloud, like much like when you go to a restaurant and the waiter recites the specials to you. The same thing, somebody would come out and they would tell you what was on that, you know, what was you're gonna get for that evening, because a lot of times, like I said, everything was kind of served all at one time and you saw everything on the table. But when this a la Russe style became more popular, then you did want to know, okay, what's gonna come up the next course? I kind of want almost like a theater program, so I can see, and maybe in some cases pace yourself, because I always say, I don't know how the ladies from back then ate a thing, because they're so corseted in those dresses, but somehow they did, or they just sipped on things, I don't know. This is almost entirely in French too, but you see things that, it's Cape Cod oysters, because that's the region that they were here in Newport. Chicken halibut, which is a small-sized halibut, but very tender. Saddle of lamb, and then you do see a Virginia glazed ham, but written in French. So again, they were using American foods, but it sounded much more refined and elegant. If you're going to have the French pronunciation, it makes it sound more fancy. So, and now this is one more Newport menu from Ward McAllister. Again, entirely in French. Apparently this was, had a gold border and the wines were printed in a red type. And actually many wealthy women would hire a French chef. And we kind of saw that on the Gilded Age TV show. I'm sure many of you watched that show, and Bertha thought he was French, and he was not, but he was playing the role, and that's what they would often do. And actually, these ladies sometimes would even try to steal chefs away from each other, because, whoever could have the top French chef, you could have the top dinners, and it just was, a way to put you head and shoulders above the rest. And so Ward even says, I'm going to read this quote, no French cook, because he said there was women, if you had to deal with your French chef who could be sometimes arrogant, he would say, no French cook will take any interest in his work unless he receives praise and criticism. But above all things, you must know how to criticize. And then he says, if he finds you are able to appreciate his work when good and condemn it when bad, he improves and gives you something of value. So that's what these women, again, I always say one dinner was trying, you would go to one dinner and the next time somebody said, I can do better than that. I'm going to throw an even better dinner. And this shows, and this is what I'm going to talk about next, the order of the dishes. So you see oysters, you see potage, the soup, then you start to see hors d'oeuvres, fish, releves, entrees, roast, entremet, and then dessert and coffee. So that's the order that typically would happen. Oysters were almost always first on the menu throughout the Gilded Age, and even before that, I've written so much about oysters because they've kind of seesawed. They were a sustenance food for a long time, and they were even served on, like in New York City, like now we can get hot dogs or pretzels on the corner. They had oyster carts to do that. But yet the wealthy loved oysters too. So any of the banquet dinners, dinner parties always had oysters as a first course. Guests would have expected them. And the French style was actually to leave the upper shell on when serving it, so they would detach the oyster and then kind of put it back in the shell, and that's how they would serve it. And then a lot of times alongside these chopped shallots that you see there, that was typical. And now the next thing was soups. So potage is actually from the medieval French term that means anything cooked in the pot. So that could be soups, stews, or even a roast. But starting in the 17th and 18th centuries, soups started to serve as a special course before the entrees. So especially consommé, which is that clear, elegant soup, and it was really prized for its flavor and presentation, and you needed a lot of skill because it had to simmer for a long time, and then you had to skim it so that it was that clear, like almost transparent soup, and it was really, again, an art form for a chef to create consommé. But typically dinners would include two soups, which was a consommé and turtle soup. Now, this is one thing I talk about that people I can't believe a lot of times, but turtle was one of the most popular foods from the 1600s all the way through to the 20th century. And yes, we're talking green sea turtles, like Finding Nemo. That's the kind of soup. And they would eat almost every part of the turtle, too. It was described, its flavor was described as being very prized. It was similar to veal. In fact, in Barbados, they called it Barbados beef. There, it was just more popular than beefsteak. It just was served on all fine dining menus. But because of that, it got overfished, got overconsumed, and now it's endangered. So terrapin cookery developed as an alternative. So these are smaller turtles. Usually, think of Maryland, they're, somewhere on the East Coast, typically terrapins. But then even they got overconsumed, so then they went to mock turtle. And mock dishes go back to the medieval times as well, as if you can't find a food, you come up with an alternative. Some of you may have heard of mock apple pie made with Ritz crackers. So mock dishes continue to be served. And the reason the mock turtle, and I have that picture from Alice in Wonderland because there was a mock turtle, because they said it did taste enough like veal that they would use calf's head and or feet to make mock turtle soup. And it really became just as popular even as the turtles, the real turtle soups on dining menus. And you see it on Ward McAllister's, actually the mock turtles at the banquet dinner, and then turtle soup and terrapin soup are at Ward McAllister's on his menu. So it really did become very popular, even on fine dining tables. And there was such a focus on soup presentation that you had these beautiful tureens, often in the shape of, so if I'm serving turtle soup, I'm gonna have a beautiful tureen like this. Fun fact, this is actually from Winterthur's collection. They have a really sizable tureen collection. So they're the conversation piece. Not only do they keep the soups from getting cold, but it's something to talk about. Maybe if you're having a beef consommé, there's on top of your tureen is a little cow that's carved or something like that. So these were just as popular, to serve soup as anything. But it was always about presentation and being showy, absolutely. And now the next course would be fish. I always followed the soup. When I looked at the Newport menus, most of the time bluefish and halibut were the most common. Again, in the days before fast transport, trains were definitely running then and really changing the game, but they were still eating what was close by, what was indigenous to those waters, and I'm sure it was those two fish. And I just wanted to show you this a la Chambord style because this was really, really popular to serve things. In fact, and I'm going to talk about it more later, I brought one here. Ta-da. So this is what they would often put on top of fish or roast, and I'll talk about it more. It's called a hatelet, but and you could put little, quenelles of either crayfish or truffles or mushrooms or something to decorate the food, and it was just all about being showy and your presentation. And the a la Chambord style meant that it was larded, so they would kind of weave bacon through there to really infuse that flavor, and then it would be a rich wine sauce. Typically Madeira would be served with that in the sauce, and it was just, again, the way this was presented. And then after that would come the relevés, and relevés is a French term that means remove, and it really signifies a dish that follows another, typically following the soup. And they were usually meats that were cooked whole or as a large joint, carved after cooking. On the Newport menus, I saw things like chicken with egg sauce, boiled Yorkshire ham with champagne sauce, saddle of lamb, leg of mutton. Here we have roast haunch of mutton. They really like mutton because that shows up. Roast saddle of lamb, roast leg of mutton, and boiled neck of mutton with caper. So these are the type of dishes you would see for a relevé. And then entrees. So this is, in America, it's come to signify the main dish, but originally, entree means entrance or beginning in French. So it originally was earlier in the meal, a way to really showcase the chef's artistry. Again, the sauces that he could put together, it was a lot of contrast with colors, textures. The sauces would vary in color. You'd often have 4 different colors of sauces with the entree course, a real emphasis on visual and culinary balance. So again, on the Newport menus, you see like these petite little pastry pies. You see sauteed chicken. You see tenderloin of beef. Again, that's larded with bacon and served with mushrooms. So anything like that, this picture is a pretty good depiction of like the little, I think of them almost like as tapas in a way, but they were served, not at the very beginning of a meal, just really put together beautiful dishes. Now we're at the high point of the meal, the roti. So it was the most extravagant and costly dish, absolutely, defined by roasting, obviously. The guests expected these rich, tender meats. They actually even had a gros roti, which is a large roast, which would have been venison, beef, veal, lamb, pork, but they also would have petit roti, so that would be like maybe game birds, some kind of poultry, something like that. In America, the preference was for game, but any kind of meat that you had is definitely appropriate for the roast. And now here, so that would have been the large roast. This is the smaller roast. They actually really like to eat like small game birds. And they weren't like the chicken that we get today that's, plumped up with salt and water and such. They were really tiny, much leaner. So again, they would often have to be larded or barded with bacon, either wrapped with it or infused inside. They were actually kind of tricky to cook because they were so lean. Birds such as woodcock and snipe that are shown here were often served with their heads on because it was a status symbol to have that long bill on the plate. And to roast these small game birds, they often had a rotisserie type of cooker where you could put several birds on one spit and then turn it as it's roasting. But that's, that was the point. You wanted to have them roasted. And then just to show you the picture on the top, so they even often served, if they're game birds such as pheasants, they would have real feathers sticking out of them or like as a pie kind of format. And then here we go with the banquet garnishes, which I showed you before, the atelettes. All this theatrics was such a central part of dining. It was presentation. The taller, sometimes you could even get the dishes. So you would have these really tall atelettes that were really tall skewers. It just ornamented the meat. It made it grand. The skewers could hold things, I mentioned before, the mushrooms and crayfish and things that could also be vegetables, truffles, anything that was considered a delicacy. Coxcombs could be ornamenting any of those dishes. Sometimes even jellies, like molded jellies, were put on there because they could glimmer in the candlelight or gaslight, and then eventually electricity. And now the next course would be called cold dishes. They were typically cold meats, aspics and pâtés, or it could be foods that were actually cooked, but then served cold and covered with this pure transparent jelly or gelatin. And in the days before powdered gelatin, so I know we think of Jell-O today, but you can still get Knox gelatin too. So this would be an unflavored plain gelatin, but they didn't have that, so they had to make their own gelatin from anything that had natural gelatin within it, like, again, calves' feet, pig's knuckles, that kind of thing. It was a really lengthy, messy process, so I'm sure they were thrilled with the Gilded Age innovation of powdered gelatin. And it just was a really popular thing because not only did it look pretty, it was like museum pieces under glass, but also it helped keep the foods from going bad in days before refrigeration. They still didn't have the refrigeration quite at the level, obviously, that we do today. So it was nice to have some dishes that would stand up to, being kept outside and not going bad, or not outside, but, just on the table or something. And now we get entremets, so those are between dishes, and those are usually all the dishes that are served after the roast, typically vegetables and sweets. Today the term most often refers to sweets only, but definitely vegetables were their own course many times because, again, it showed that you had the money in order to get vegetables, especially out of season, they either had to travel to you somehow, whether it be, the railroads, like I said, really helped with that, but steamships, or even when I worried about, the $1,000 dinner, James Parkinson sent guys on horseback to go get some of the food that he needed. But by this time, it wouldn't have, they would have gotten them easier, or they would have had hot houses, perhaps. Like a lot of people of wealth had their own hot houses or could get access to them, and that's how they could get these vegetables that were out of season. And then, of course, the pastry course. So pastry was really a broad term for sweet dishes made by the pastry cook, typically anything that was baked. Sometimes pastry and dessert were kind of grouped together on menus. But you definitely get gâteaux, all of these beautiful cakes here, and they could range, in size and shape, but it could be like cream pies all the way up to these really gorgeous celebration cakes, typically made from things like puff pastry, even short crust pastry, sponge cake, meringue, and then ornamented with any number of things like almonds, chocolate, creams, or even liqueurs. So that's what you see here in the pastry course. And then these are the cookies that all of you have here, those Gâteaux de Milans, and they are a buttery cookie with a hint of lemon. Some recipes actually call for rum or some kind of liquor or milk or cream. I used milk typically with mine. And I learned about this recipe. There was a 19th century French chef named Pierre Blot, and he came to New York City first he was a French teacher. He perfected his American or his English here by doing that, and then his background was in cooking, and so he started with writing cookbooks, and then he opened up what he called the New York Cooking Academy, and he was the professor of gastronomy, he called himself, and he taught women. There could have been, I'm sure, women that came through this very mansion at some time that went to his classes, because in the days before we had internet, TV, whatever, it was entertainment. He was very charismatic. So he was, giving cooking classes for all types of people. Even young men would go to his cooking classes, like bachelor men. And so he taught this cookie, and he said the edges need to be slightly burned in order for the middle to come out correctly. So when they would come out of the oven, what you do is you take the cookie cutter and put it back on top when the cookie's still kind of warm, and it trims off those burnt edges, and it has an egg glaze on there. And then in France, and you guys can maybe tell me if this is true, but they're still featured as Christmas cookies sometimes. I don't know, I've seen them as listed that way as Christmas cookies still in France. And then ices and ice creams were really popular. On Newport menus, you'd see them as glacés. Typically, vanilla was one of the most popular flavors. You also see some fruit flavors like strawberry, pineapple, even things like ginger, raspberry. It just, they liked all those flavors. Chocolate didn't become nearly as much of a flavoring until later in the Gilded Age. I always use this as a reference. The 1851 $1,000 dinner menu had 4 courses of desserts. There was not one bit of chocolate on that whole menu. So chocolate was difficult to process. And once they finally figured that out, it was a Dutchman named Van Houten, and then that's where you hear that Dutch process, cocoa. Then you start to see chocolate enter a lot more desserts, and it just make it easier to bake and cook with and incorporate in ice creams and things. And then also during the Gilded Age, they loved fruit as, an ending to a meal. And look at these beautiful displays here. It's just another way to show off your artistry and skills of the chef. They had specialized dishes and utensils for certain fruits, like how to, I saw this one reference in a cookbook, how to eat oranges like they do in Havana, you know, like they would have a certain way, utensils, how to do that. On the Newport menus, I saw fruit such as watermelons, bananas, raisins, and also simply listed as just fruits, so like kind of a general category of fruit. So again, what is available at the time? What do you have, you know, in front of you or available to you? And then dessert wines were really popular towards the end of the meal. So these are things such as sherry, Madeira, port wine, fortified wines, which came from years ago when these wines had to take these long voyages around the world. Fortifying them with some kind of other liqueur really helped preserve them over time and enhance their flavor too. So they were, you know, much more concentrated, often served as an after-dinner drink, or alongside strong black coffee, café noir. This originated with the French upper classes in the late 17th century. Strong black coffee with no milk. It was only some sugar. It was believed to aid digestion. So you can imagine after some of these really long meals, it was important to do that. And it often was, like I said, paired with or enhanced with an after-dinner liqueur as well. So that's what you would see there. And that's my last one, because I know everyone probably wants to eat something, but I'm happy to take any questions too. Sure.
Before the serving by staff from one setting to another, when all the things are put on the table at once, how did people share? Did they physically lift up the platters and?
Yeah, I'm guessing, unfortunately, I don't know as much about the à la française because I've really focused more on that like 19th century. By then, à la Russe style was really more popular, but I think, you know, it may have been passed around like that, but you know, they had wait staff as well too to help, as far as I know. Yeah. Anyone else?
Any other questions? Yes,
Sure.
When you talk about the $1,000 dinner,
Mm-hmm.
what is that in today's price?
Yeah, it's about, well, when I did that research in 2015 or 16, it was 32,000. So it's probably way up from that now, but yeah. So, and it was called $1,000 dinner because it cost $1,000 to put together at that point. Yeah, so just crazy. Just what they had to do. Yeah, and it really did lead into all the Gilded Age excessiveness, absolutely.
Hi there. I'm just wondering, how much time was allotted per course as you're digesting?
I know. Honestly, I kind of wondered that too. You know, I haven't ever found anything that says how much time. And I've had people ask me too, like especially for one of these huge multi-course dinners. I mean, there's several things on the menu. Like, are you eating every single thing, or are you just taking a little bite? You know, it just really kind of varies, I think, in what people wanted. But I mean so 17 courses over 12 hours, I mean, it definitely would have been, you know, not even one course an hour, you know, so. But some courses too, when you see these multi-course dinners, one course can be just that midway pause, you know, the sorbet or something, so that's not gonna take as long to put together. So, yeah. Yeah, you had a lot of time on your hands if you're going to one of these dinners, for sure.
Yes, oftentimes we know that they also had a corresponding breakfast menu because they'd have to stay early the next morning.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Don't want to be in front of the speaker. Thank you, Becky, so much. I'm so sorry now to have our humble box lunches, but this was really lovely. Thank you so much. And I also want to take an opportunity to thank everyone who registered on Zoom. We will see you tomorrow morning when we rejoin at Margot House for our speaking portion. This concludes the speaking portion for today, and we'll have lunch, and then I will share further directions about our breakout sessions this afternoon.
before we depart. But again, Becky, thank you so much.
Sure.